In the dust of forgotten empires, one voice still rises from broken clay, crying out across 4,000 years. It is the story of a king who sought to conquer death itself, and in failing, discovered what it truly means to live. The desert winds sweep across the ruins of Mesopotamia, whispering through broken walls and scattered bricks, carrying echoes from a time when the first cities rose out of the floodplains of the Tigris and the Euphrates. Among those cities was Uruk, a place of immense walls, bustling markets, and sacred temples. Today, it lies silent, a mound of dust and stone, but once it was the home of a ruler whose story would outlast even the mighty empires that followed. His name was Gilgamesh, and though thousands of years have passed since he walked the earth, his voice still speaks through the oldest surviving story ever written. He was remembered as part man and part god, a king of Uruk whose deeds were carved into clay tablets that somehow endured when kingdoms and dynasties turned to dust. His tale is one of contradictions. He was said to be 2 parts divine and 1 part mortal, blessed with the strength of a god, but burdened with the fears of a man. In his own time, his people may have known him as a warrior king, building walls and ruling with power, but in legend, he became something far greater. His story was not merely about battles or conquests, but about the deepest questions every human being must face. What does it mean to live? What does it mean to die? How do we face the limits of our own mortality? These were questions that haunted him, and they are questions that still haunt us today. When the scribes of Mesopotamia pressed wedge-shaped marks into clay, they were not only keeping records of grain or taxes, they were also preserving myths and memories that carried the heartbeat of their world. Among those writings, the story of Gilgamesh emerged, a tapestry of gods and monsters, of friendship and grief, of triumph and despair. It is older than Homer's epics, older than the legends of the Hebrew patriarchs, older than the myths of Greece and Rome. To call it the world's first story is no exaggeration. It is the foundation stone of literature, the first great attempt to wrestle with the human condition. Yet for centuries, this story lay buried and forgotten. The people who once recited it at feasts or inscribed it in temple schools were gone. Empires rose and fell, each leaving their ruins scattered across the desert. Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, all came and went. The language of the tablets was lost, their meaning hidden. Gilgamesh himself, once hailed as the mighty king of Uruk, faded into shadow. For thousands of years, he was as dead as the dust beneath the Mesopotamian sun. But memory is stubborn. The ruins of Uruk still carried the outlines of greatness. Archaeologists who came in the 19th century uncovered vast stretches of wall, so immense that the ancient stories claim, "Look upon the wall of Uruk, measure its height," was no mere boast. The city had indeed been monumental. And within the ruins of another place, the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, fragments of Gilgamesh's story were uncovered. The cuneiform tablets, baked hard by fire when the city was destroyed, held words no one had read for more than 2 millennia. Piece by piece, they were deciphered until the forgotten king spoke again. The man remembered on those tablets was no simple hero. At the start of his tale, he was a tyrant, ruling his city with arrogance, taking what he wished and disregarding the cries of his people. The gods themselves had to intervene, shaping from clay a wild man named Enkidu to challenge him. This confrontation would become one of the epic's most enduring themes: the balance of power, the humbling of pride, the transformation of kingship. For Gilgamesh was not just meant to be remembered as a warrior or builder. He was meant to be remembered as a man who changed, who grew, who faced suffering and sought wisdom. What makes the epic extraordinary is not just its age, but its intimacy. Across thousands of years, through broken clay and fading symbols, we can still hear the anguish of a king mourning the death of his friend. We can still feel his terror at the thought of his own end. we can still follow him on his desperate search for immortality, not through victories on the battlefield, but through the timeless hope of defeating death itself. The voice of Gilgamesh, cracked and incomplete though it may be, speaks with startling clarity to every human being who has ever stood by a grave or watched the years slip through their fingers. The walls of Uruk, once so mighty, are ruins now. The palaces where kings sat in majesty are gone. The gods of Mesopotamia, worshipped with incense and sacrifice, are silent. Yet the words carved into clay remain. They tell us that Gilgamesh was a king of Uruk, a man who lived 4,000 years before Christ, in a land where rivers brought both life and destruction. They tell us he was remembered as both a hero and a warning, as one who sought the impossible and returned with wisdom instead. They tell us that long before our modern civilizations dreamed their own myths, a Sumerian king looked at death and asked the same questions we still ask today. Gilgamesh is more than a relic of the past. He is a mirror held up to the human soul. We may never know how much of his tale was history and how much was legend, but that is part of its power. He is the bridge between man and myth, between memory and imagination. His story survived because it carried truths that could not die with his city or his empire. The forgotten king of Uruk may have ruled for a time, but through story, he endures forever. As the sun sinks over the barren plains of Mesopotamia, it paints the land in gold, as if reminding us of the treasures hidden beneath the dust. Somewhere beneath that soil lies Uruk, once proud, now broken. Yet the walls of Gilgamesh stand still, in words, in memory, in the story that refuses to be silenced. He was a man who sought immortality, and in the end, he found it not in eternal life, but in eternal remembrance. The story of Gilgamesh could never have existed without the world that gave him birth, and that world was Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers. The Tigris and the Euphrates, fed by distant mountains, carved their way through the plains, bringing with them both blessing and terror. When they flooded, they deposited rich silt that made the land fertile beyond imagination. But when their waters rose without warning, they drowned villages and washed away the labor of entire seasons. It was this fragile balance between life and destruction that forced human beings to invent new ways of living together. Here, in the ancient land of Sumer, civilization as we know it was born. The earliest settlers learned to channel the wild waters into canals, to tame them enough to water their crops instead of destroy them. Over time, irrigation transformed the plains into fields of barley, wheat, dates, and vegetables. Herds of sheep and goats grazed on the banks. This mastery of water gave rise to something entirely new, the city. People gathered not only to survive, but to build, to trade, to worship, and to govern. Among these cities, none shone brighter than Uruk, where Gilgamesh himself would one day reign. Uruk was a marvel of its age, a city of walls and markets, temples and towers. Its very name became synonymous with power. The people of Uruk built with mud brick, stacking layer upon layer until great walls surrounded them, walls that would later be praised in the epic itself. These defenses were not merely for protection from raiders. They were monuments to human ambition, to the idea that a city could stand against the chaos of the wild and the uncertainty of the rivers. In the heart of these cities rose ziggurats, massive step towers that reached toward the heavens. They were not built for people to live in, but for the gods to descend. Each level carried offerings, rituals, and sacred ceremonies, with the shrine crowning the top as a bridge between earth and sky. The ziggurat of Uruk, dedicated to the goddess Inanna, dominated the skyline. It told every inhabitant that the city was not merely a cluster of homes, but a place chosen by the gods themselves. Temples were more than places of worship. They were the centers of economy, education, and administration. Priests oversaw not only sacrifices, but also the storage of grain, the distribution of water, and the keeping of records. In their halls, the first scribes pressed styluses into wet clay, creating wedge-shaped signs that recorded debts, trade, and offerings. Out of these humble marks grew cuneiform, the first true writing system. At first, it was used to count bushels of grain and flocks of sheep, but soon it recorded myths, hymns, laws, and stories. The tale of Gilgamesh itself was born out of this world of clay and reed stylus, where words could endure long after voices were silent. The city-states of Sumer were fiercely independent. Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Nippur, and Kish each had their own patron deity, their own rulers, their own rivalries. Wars were fought over water rights, over boundary stones, over pride. Yet in their competition, they drove one another to greater heights of architecture, art, and innovation. This rivalry created a fertile ground for legends, for heroes who would rise above ordinary men to embody the spirit of their people. Gilgamesh, whether real or imagined, was one of these heroes, larger than life, shaped by a culture that valued strength, cunning, and divine favor. The air of Mesopotamia was heavy with the scent of baked bread and clay ovens, with the smoke of sacrifices rising to the heavens. Fishermen cast their nets in canals, farmers plowed fields with oxen, and merchants led caravans loaded with copper, lapis lazuli, and wool. This was not a world of scattered tribes, but of organized labor, of temples that employed thousands, of kings who commanded armies, and of scribes who could fix a man's name into eternity with a single press of the stylus. Out of this mixture of wealth and worry, of faith and fear, the imagination of a people turned to story. The gods of Sumer were everywhere: Anu, the god of the sky; Enlil, lord of the wind; and Inanna, goddess of love and war, ruled from their temples. Every storm, every flood, every victory, and every failure was believed to be their doing. Life was fragile, and people sought meaning in the capricious will of their deities. It is no surprise, then, that Gilgamesh, who was remembered as 2 parts god and 1 part man, stood at the center of their imagination. He was a bridge between human vulnerability and divine strength, a figure who could embody the struggle of all humanity against the forces that ruled the world. To understand Gilgamesh, one must understand the burden of mortality that haunted the Sumerians. Death was a certainty, and the afterlife was imagined as a shadowy underworld where souls ate dust and drank clay. No paradise awaited the ordinary person, only a dreary existence below the earth. This grim view gave urgency to life on the surface. It was in this context that Gilgamesh's quest for immortality took on such weight. He was not simply a king seeking more power. He was a man desperate to escape the fate that awaited all mortals, a fate that the Sumerians knew all too well. Uruk was a jewel among cities, but it was also a crucible. Its people had mastered water and mud, invented writing and mathematics, and raised towers to heaven, yet they also lived in fear of flood, famine, and war. Their lives were short, their struggles unending. From such a world, stories emerged not just to entertain, but to explain, to comfort, to preserve meaning against the tide of time. The Epic of Gilgamesh is one such story, born from a people who had everything and nothing, who could build cities of wonder yet still feared the grave. The birth of civilization in Mesopotamia was not a gentle dawn, but a hard-fought struggle against nature and against each other. Yet from this struggle came the first sparks of human creativity, the first lines of poetry, the first written laws, the first recorded heroes. And at the heart of it all was Uruk, with its mighty walls and its legendary king. The story of Gilgamesh is inseparable from this world, because it was this world, its triumphs, its fears, its faith, that shaped him. Without the rivers, without the temples, without the scribes and the clay, there would be no story to tell. What survives today is more than fragments of myth. It is the voice of an entire civilization, speaking across millennia. The clay tablets that carry Gilgamesh's name are echoes of a people who invented cities, who invented writing, and who asked the oldest question of all: what does it mean to be human? Out of mud brick and reeds, out of flood and famine, they built the foundation of the world we live in. Out of their fears and hopes, they gave us the world's first epic. It is their story, and it is his story, and in many ways, it is ours as well. The story of Gilgamesh could never have reached us without the fragile, enduring miracle of writing. Long before parchment, paper, or printing presses, there was clay. In the river valleys of Mesopotamia, where reeds grew thick along the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates, scribes took the simplest of tools, a sharpened reed stylus, and pressed marks into soft tablets of clay. Each wedge-shaped impression became a sign, and those signs formed words, and those words formed the first literature in human history. What began as a way to record the number of sheep in a pen or jars of grain in a storehouse slowly transformed into a medium for memory, myth, and meaning. Out of clay and symbol, the voices of the ancient world began to speak. The invention of cuneiform was driven by necessity. Early cities like Uruk and Ur needed ways to track goods, to keep records of trade, offerings, and debts. Oral memory was not enough for a society that grew more complex by the year. So the scribes carved their symbols into tablets, dried them in the sun, and stored them away. These records became the first archives, the ledgers of civilization. Yet, as time passed, these same marks began to capture more than accounts. They preserved hymns to the gods, royal decrees, lists of kings, and eventually, stories that explained the mysteries of life and death. What was once a tally became a tale. It was within this system that the Epic of Gilgamesh was born. On clay tablets, across centuries, his story was copied and recopied by scribes who studied in the temple schools. Each student, practicing their signs, ensured that the voice of Uruk's legendary king would echo far beyond the city walls. They pressed his triumphs, his grief, and his desperate search for immortality into wet clay, immortalizing him in a way no wall or palace ever could. Even when Uruk itself crumbled, even when the gods of Sumer were forgotten, the tablets endured, waiting beneath the soil for thousands of years. The clay itself was both fragile and eternal. A tablet left to the weather would crumble to dust, but one buried beneath earth or hardened in fire could last forever. Ironically, the destruction of cities sometimes ensured the survival of their stories. When invaders burned palaces and libraries, the flames baked the tablets hard, preserving them for ages. This accident of history meant that the words of Gilgamesh could survive long after the empires that recorded them were gone. For centuries, however, those words lay silent. The language of cuneiform was forgotten, the ability to read it lost to time. The tablets themselves were buried under layers of rubble and sand. Travelers and merchants in later ages sometimes found strange bricks covered in mysterious marks, but no one could read them. The voice of Gilgamesh was trapped in silence for more than 2 millennia. That silence was finally broken in the 19th century. Archaeologists digging in the ruins of Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrian Empire, uncovered the library of King Ashurbanipal. There, beneath mounds of dust and stone, lay thousands upon thousands of clay tablets. It was one of the greatest discoveries in the history of archaeology. A library from the 7th century before Christ, preserved by fire when the city was destroyed. Within this library lay myths, prayers, scientific texts, medical recipes, and histories. And among them, buried and broken, were fragments of the story of Gilgamesh. The tablets were shipped to museums in Europe, where scholars puzzled over the strange wedge-shaped script. It took decades of painstaking work to unlock their meaning. Piece by piece, the signs were deciphered, and words began to form. When the lines of Gilgamesh's epic were finally read, the world realized it was hearing a voice older than Homer, older than the Bible, older than any other surviving story. The forgotten king of Uruk spoke again, his grief and longing as sharp as the day they were first pressed into clay. The rediscovery of the tablets was nothing less than the recovery of memory itself. For centuries, scholars had wondered about the roots of civilization, the origins of literature, the earliest attempts to answer humanity's greatest questions. And here, in these fragile slabs of clay, was proof that 4,000 years ago, men and women had already asked what it means to live, what it means to die, and whether any legacy can outlast the grave. The tablets from Nineveh were not the only ones. Over time, more fragments were found in other Mesopotamian sites, each filling gaps in the story. Some contained the Sumerian poems that formed the earliest versions of the epic. Others carried later Akkadian retellings, woven together into the fuller narrative we know today. Together, they revealed a tradition that had evolved over centuries, shaped by generations of scribes, yet carrying a single thread: the life and quest of Gilgamesh, king of Uruk. There is something haunting about the way the story survived. Written not on parchment, which rots, nor on papyrus, which decays, but on clay, which endures. The same material used to build homes, walls, and pots became the vessel for human thought. The medium was as humble as the mud beneath the feet of the Sumerians, yet it became the foundation of literature itself. The stylus pressed into the clay was not only a tool of record, but a chisel of memory, carving words into eternity. The invention of writing in Mesopotamia did more than preserve one story. It transformed the way humans understood themselves. No longer dependent on memory and song alone, people could preserve laws, prayers, genealogies, and myths with precision. They could reach beyond the limits of life and death. A man could die, but his words could live on, pressed into a tablet and passed down through the ages. For the first time, memory could outlast mortality. Perhaps this is why the story of Gilgamesh, obsessed with death and the search for eternal life, found such perfect expression in clay. The very act of writing made him immortal. When we hold these tablets today in museums, we are holding more than artifacts. We are holding voices. We are holding questions asked by people who lived 4,000 years ago but felt the same fears and hopes we feel now. The clay tablets whisper across time that human beings have always longed to be remembered, always feared the darkness of death, and always sought meaning in the face of mortality. The invention of writing gave birth to civilization's memory. The discovery of the tablets gave that memory back to us, and in that fragile union of clay and word, of scribes and scholars, of ancient ruins and modern rediscovery, the oldest story in the world emerged again. Gilgamesh, the forgotten king, stepped out of the dust, his tale preserved by clay, carried by time, and waiting, always waiting, to be read again. Beneath the layers of myth, beyond the towering walls of poetry and divine exaggeration, there lingers the question that has haunted scholars for generations. Was Gilgamesh real? Was the mighty king of Uruk, remembered as 2 parts god and 1 part man, a figure of flesh and bone who once walked the sun-baked streets of Mesopotamia? Or was he only ever a story, shaped by imagination and longing, a symbol of humanity's eternal struggle against mortality? The truth lies somewhere in between. Though the epic surrounds him with gods, monsters, and cosmic quests, scattered fragments of history suggest there may have been a ruler of Uruk around 2,700 years before Christ who became the seed of legend. In the Sumerian king, lists inscribed on ancient tablets, Gilgamesh appears as a name among other rulers. These lists were not myths, but attempts at chronology, attempts by scribes to place in order the succession of kings who governed the city-states of Mesopotamia. They tell us that Gilgamesh ruled Uruk for 126 years, a number impossible for any mortal, yet common in these texts, where extraordinary reigns were a way of signifying greatness. Such exaggerations may conceal a kernel of truth. A powerful king whose memory burned so brightly that centuries later he was transformed into something more than human. Archaeology, too, has given us faint traces. Uruk itself has been unearthed from beneath the desert soil. Its massive walls and monumental architecture, confirming the city's grandeur. Though no inscription has been uncovered in which Gilgamesh speaks in his own voice, there are temple hymns and dedications that mention his name as if he were once real. He was remembered not only as a king, but as a builder, a man who raised walls and temples that anchored Uruk in both stone and memory. The story itself begins by praising those very walls, inviting the listener to walk their circuit, to see what Gilgamesh had wrought. That detail carries the ring of history. Kings are remembered for the monuments they build. It is possible that Gilgamesh was not a solitary man, but a composite, a figure in whom many rulers' deeds were gathered into one. Sumerian tradition often wove strands of memory together, binding them into a single hero whose life encompassed more than any one human could achieve. The battles he fought, the journeys he took, the walls he built. These may have been echoes of real events, magnified by time, embellished by poets, and given the weight of eternity by scribes pressing them into clay. The historical world in which Gilgamesh may have lived was a turbulent one. Around 2,700 years before Christ, the city-states of Sumer were locked in constant rivalry. Uruk, Ur, Lagash, and Kish competed for dominance, each ruled by kings who claimed divine favor. Warfare was common, with armies of spearmen clashing on dusty plains, banners raised high, and chariots rattling across the fields. Kings were expected not only to protect their people, but to expand their power, seizing new lands, building new walls, and dedicating victories to their gods. If Gilgamesh lived in this world, he would have been one among many warrior kings, yet one whose memory eclipsed all the rest. Some scholars believe his reign may have marked a turning point in Uruk's history, when the city rose to preeminence over its rivals. His name may have been attached to that golden age, remembered by later generations as the time when Uruk stood at its strongest. Over centuries, those memories blurred, and Gilgamesh grew into a semi-divine figure, his humanity cloaked in godlike qualities. But within the exaggeration, the echo of a man remains, a king, who walked the earth, commanded soldiers, issued decrees, and left behind works of stone that endured for centuries. The blurring of man and myth is not unique to Gilgamesh. Throughout history, great rulers have been transformed by memory and story. The Greek Achilles may have had a kernel of reality in the warriors of the Trojan Wars. King Arthur of Britain may have been inspired by forgotten leaders resisting invasion. So too, Gilgamesh may have been a man of Uruk, later exalted until his humanity was wrapped in legend. What separates Gilgamesh from the others is that his story was written down so early, preserved on clay, allowing us to glimpse the moment when history first became myth. The historical Gilgamesh would not have slain forest guardians or spoken with gods. He would have led armies, managed irrigation canals, collected tribute, and built temples to honor his city's deities. He would have presided over festivals and sacrifices, ensuring that Uruk's patron goddess Inanna received her due. He would have sat in council with advisors, listening to disputes and rendering judgment. Yet, for all the ordinariness of these duties, he was remembered in ways no other king was. Something about his rule, or about how people wanted to remember his rule, marked him as unique. The transformation of Gilgamesh into a legend reveals something profound about the ancient imagination. His people did not wish merely to record his name in a list. They wanted to tell his story, to give him struggles and victories that echoed their own fears and hopes. They imagined him confronting the monsters of the world, defying the gods, and seeking immortality, because in him they saw themselves. His greatness lay not only in what he did, but in what he came to symbolize: the human struggle to live, to endure, and to be remembered. So when we speak of the historical Gilgamesh, we speak of shadows and fragments, of a king whose name flickers through broken tablets and king lists. We cannot know his face, his voice, or the precise years of his reign, yet we can sense the weight of his presence, the way memory clung to him until it crystallized into myth. He was likely a man, but a man so deeply inscribed into the consciousness of his people that he became a bridge between history and eternity. Perhaps that is the truest form of immortality. To live so that your deeds are remembered, reshaped, retold, until centuries later, strangers speak your name with awe. The man Gilgamesh may have died long ago, his body returned to the dust of Mesopotamia, but the legend of Gilgamesh lives still, bound into clay, carried by time, and waiting, always waiting, to be read again. The epic does not begin with a hero beloved by his people. It does not open with the image of a wise king who ruled with mercy and justice. Instead, the prologue paints a picture that is stark and unsettling. Gilgamesh, the mighty king of Uruk, is introduced as a tyrant. His strength is unmatched, his divine blood undeniable, but his people cry out under his heavy hand. He is loved by the gods, yet despised by those who must live beneath his rule. This is the paradox at the heart of the tale. A man touched by greatness, yet corrupted by pride. The introduction of the story invites the audience to gaze upon the walls of Uruk, to walk their circuit, to marvel at their construction. These walls are the testament to Gilgamesh's power, his ability to harness the labor of thousands and turn mudbrick into immortality. Yet behind these walls lies a restless city. The people whisper in anger. They resent the king who claims the first rights over their daughters, who pushes their sons into endless toil, who treats them as subjects to be bent rather than citizens to be honored. Gilgamesh is not the benevolent ruler of legend. He is a man of excess, driven by desire and unchecked by law. It is important that the epic begins here, not at the height of his quest or at the depths of his grief, but at the beginning of his transformation. The tyrant king must be broken before he can learn wisdom. In this way, the prologue is not simply a description, but a warning. Power without restraint destroys both ruler and ruled. Gilgamesh is presented as one who possesses everything yet lacks the one quality that could make his greatness endure: compassion. The gods are complicit in his rule. They have granted him unmatched strength, they have blessed him with beauty, and they have given him wisdom beyond ordinary men. Yet these gifts have made him arrogant. He believes himself untouchable, his will supreme. The people cry out not only against Gilgamesh, but also against the heavens themselves, demanding relief from the torment of their king. It is their prayers that stir the gods to act, setting in motion the events that will shape the entire epic. The prologue also serves another purpose. It establishes Gilgamesh as larger than life. He is no ordinary mortal, but 2 parts divine and 1 part human. This balance, so close to godhood yet still bound to mortality, creates the tension that drives his story. He cannot escape death, though he is stronger than any man. He cannot claim immortality, though he rules as though he were eternal. The people hate him because he behaves as if he is beyond their world, beyond their suffering, yet he is not. He is as vulnerable to grief, to loss, and to the certainty of death as they are. The tone of the prologue is both reverent and accusatory. It calls him great, yet condemns him as cruel. It marvels at his power, yet dwells on his abuse of it. The storyteller is setting the stage not only for Gilgamesh's exploits, but for his transformation. The tyrant must become the seeker, the cruel king must become the mourning friend, and the arrogant ruler must become the humbled man. The prologue does not hide his flaws. It highlights them so that the journey to come will be all the more meaningful. For the people of Uruk, Gilgamesh is a burden. They live in fear of his desires, uncertain when he will claim what is theirs. They live in exhaustion from the endless work demanded to glorify his reign. Their voices rise together, and their suffering becomes so great that even the gods must intervene. This is the soil from which the story of Enkidu will grow, for the gods answer the people's cries not by destroying Gilgamesh, but by creating his equal, a wild man who will challenge him and change him. But before that turning point, the epic insists that we see him as he was, brilliant, powerful, divine, and terrible. The mythic prologue is as much about humanity as it is about its king. It reminds us that even those touched by the gods can fall into tyranny. It reminds us that unchecked power breeds resentment, that the cries of the oppressed do not go unheard, and it reminds us that transformation often begins in failure. The Gilgamesh we meet at the opening is not the hero he will become. He is a warning. He is what power looks like before it is tempered by friendship, loss, and wisdom. And so the story begins not with triumph, but with discontent. The mighty city of Uruk, with its glorious walls, is restless. Its king, though unmatched in might, is unloved. Its people cry out to the heavens for deliverance, and the gods, in their wisdom, prepare an answer. Gilgamesh stands at the threshold of a journey he cannot yet imagine, but first he must be brought down from his throne of arrogance. Only then can the epic truly begin. The cries of Uruk did not vanish into the hot Mesopotamian air. The people's voices rose to the heavens, heavy with desperation, and the gods listened. They saw Gilgamesh, strong as no other man, brilliant and beautiful, yet swollen with pride and blinded by his own desires. They saw the walls he had built, the temples he had raised, and they saw too the suffering of his people who lived under his relentless hand. In their council, they resolved to answer the prayers of Uruk not with destruction, but with balance. If Gilgamesh was unmatched, they would shape one who could match him. If he ruled as if untouchable, they would send one who could touch his heart. Thus began the creation of Enkidu. The goddess Aruru, mother of creation, was called forth to fashion this new being. With her divine hands, she reached into the clay of the steppe, the same clay from which humanity itself had been formed. She shaped it with intention, pressing into it both strength and wildness. Enkidu was not born of city walls or temple rituals. He was born of earth and untamed land. His hair flowed long and thick like a beast of the plains. His body was covered with shaggy locks, and he lived as the animals did, drinking at the watering holes, roaming with gazelles, and tearing up grass with the deer. He was not made to be a king, nor to build monuments, nor to command armies. He was made to be a mirror, a balance to Gilgamesh's arrogance, a reminder that power does not belong only to cities and thrones. Enkidu was the wild man, innocent of civilization, closer to the natural world than to human society. He feared no predator, for he was as strong as they. Hunters who glimpsed him in the steppe fled back to their villages in terror, for he loosed their traps and freed the animals they relied upon. Where Gilgamesh imposed his will on people, Enkidu restored freedom to the creatures of the wild. The people of Uruk, hearing of this strange and powerful being, grew hopeful. If one such as Enkidu could be brought into their world, perhaps he might stand against Gilgamesh, might break his arrogance and give the city peace. A hunter, whose traps Enkidu had spoiled again and again, went to the city and spoke of the wild man to Gilgamesh himself. The king listened, curious but also disturbed. For the first time, he heard of another whose strength might rival his own. Gilgamesh sent for a woman of wisdom, Shamhat, a temple priestess, skilled in knowledge of the gods and the ways of men. She would be the bridge between wilderness and civilization, the one to lure Enkidu from the steppe and bring him into human life. When Shamhat went to the watering place, she found him among the animals. There, at the edge of water and wilderness, she stripped herself of her garments and opened her arms to him. Enkidu, who had known only the innocence of beasts, was drawn to her. For 6 days and 7 nights, they were joined, and in that joining, something changed within him. The animals who had once run beside him now fled from him. He could no longer race with the gazelles or drink freely at the pools. The wild had rejected him, for he had crossed into the world of men. Shamhat spoke to him gently, telling him of bread to eat, of wine to drink, of the city where people lived together in walls of stone. She told him of Gilgamesh, the mighty king who oppressed his people, and of the chance to challenge him. Enkidu listened. Though he was strong, stronger than any hunter, stronger than any beast, He had never known what it was to dwell among humans. A new hunger stirred in him, not just for food or for companionship, but for meaning. He followed Shamat toward Uruk, leaving behind the open steppe that had been his home. On the way, he learned, he tasted bread for the first time, rough and filling. He drank wine, and the fire of it loosened his heart. He washed himself with oil, clothed himself in garments, and became, in part, a man of the city. Yet he did not lose his strength, nor the primal force of the wild. He carried it with him, a reminder of what he had been, a balance to what he was becoming. The people of Uruk watched in awe when he arrived. Here was one who looked like a man, but carried himself like the wilderness itself. His stature was mighty, his arms thick with power, his eyes sharp and untamed. Whispers spread quickly through the streets. This was the one who could stand against Gilgamesh. This was the answer to their cries. The gods had answered with balance. Where Gilgamesh had been born into privilege, Enkidu had been shaped by dust and clay. Where Gilgamesh ruled through fear, Enkidu embodied freedom and the strength of nature. The two were destined to clash, for only through confrontation could transformation come. The creation of Enkidu is one of the most profound moments in the epic because it reveals the wisdom of the storytellers. They understood that no king, however mighty, can remain unchecked. They understood that power, without balance, becomes tyranny. Enkidu was not only the rival of Gilgamesh, he was his counterpart, his other half, the missing piece that would shape the rest of his journey. Without Enkidu, Gilgamesh would have remained forever a tyrant. With him, the king of Uruk would learn friendship, grief, and ultimately wisdom. The gods did not strike Gilgamesh down, they gave him a companion, and in doing so, they gave the world one of the greatest stories ever told. A story that begins with a tyrant and a wild man, destined to meet, destined to fight, and destined to become brothers. The creation of Enkidu was the beginning of transformation, not only for Gilgamesh, but for all who would hear his tale across the ages. Enkidu was born of clay and wilderness, shaped by the hand of a goddess, and left to roam free across the open steppe. He lived among the animals, drinking at the watering holes, running with the gazelles, breaking the traps of hunters, and tearing open nets so that beasts might escape. His strength was unmatched, his body covered in wild hair, his mind untroubled by the thoughts of men. He was the answer of the gods to the cries of Uruk, a being created to stand equal to Gilgamesh. But at first he knew nothing of cities, nothing of bread or wine, nothing of human companionship. He was a force of nature, pure and untamed. The hunters who saw him were terrified. Their traps no longer worked, their prey vanished, and their lives became threatened by this wild man who lived as a beast but bore the form of a human. One such hunter, desperate, went to Uruk and told the king of what he had seen. Gilgamesh listened and sent Shamhat, a woman of wisdom and sacred duty, a priestess of love and fertility. She was not merely a courtesan, but a servant of the goddess, one who understood the mysteries of desire and the transformation it could bring. Her task was to bring Enkidu from the wilderness into the world of men, to tame him not with force, but with intimacy. Shamhat went out to the place where the animals drank, and there she waited. When Enkidu came down to the waters, naked and unashamed among the gazelles, she revealed herself to him. She opened her arms, and he was drawn to her. For 6 days and 7 nights they lay together, and in that union, something in Enkidu began to change. The gazelles who once accepted him turned away. The animals who had been his companions fled from him. The steppe, no longer, claimed him as one of its own. In choosing her, he had crossed a boundary from wilderness into humanity. When the days were done, Shamhat spoke to him. She told him of bread, of wine, of music, of the life of the city. She told him of Uruk, with its towering walls and its bustling streets, its markets, its temples, its festivals. She told him of Gilgamesh, the mighty king, strong as a lion, yet cruel to his people. She painted for him a vision of a new life, one richer and more complex than the wild could ever give. Enkidu listened, his heart stirred with a longing he had never known. Shamhat gave him bread, and though at first he did not understand, she showed him how to eat, and he found it good. She gave him wine, and he drank, and the fire of it filled his chest and loosened his laughter. He anointed his skin with oil, and the roughness of the wild softened into the sheen of a man. She clothed him in garments, and he stood not as a beast but as one who belonged to the world of human beings. Through Shamhat, Enkidu learned to speak in fuller words, to dream of more than survival. This moment is one of the most profound in the epic because it reflects the transition of humanity itself. Just as Enkidu left the wilderness to join the city, so too had ancient humanity once left behind the life of the hunter and the wanderer to build villages, farms, and temples. The taming of Enkidu is not merely the story of one man, it is the story of civilization. Bread and wine, clothing and oil, song and ritual, these are the marks of what it means to be human. In Shamhat's embrace, Enkidu became the symbol of this great passage, the crossing from nature into culture, from instinct into choice. Yet his transformation was not a loss, but a gain. Though he could no longer run with the gazelles or drink at the watering holes like the beasts, he gained new strength. The strength of reason, of companionship, of purpose. He no longer belonged wholly to the animals, nor yet wholly to the city, but stood between the two, carrying with him the wildness of the steppe and the wisdom of the temple. This balance would make him the perfect rival and companion for Gilgamesh, for only one who carried both the untamed power of nature and the cultivated strength of civilization could stand beside a king. In the story of Shamhat and Enkidu, desire becomes more than passion, it becomes transformation. The act that binds them is not merely of the body, but of fate. Through her, he enters into the world of men, and through him, Gilgamesh will be changed. The sacred harlot is not a figure of shame, but of power, the one chosen by the gods to guide the wild man to his destiny. She is the teacher of civilization, the first priestess to initiate him into the mysteries of humanity. As Enkidu walked beside her toward Uruk, leaving behind the open plains, he carried within him both loss and promise. He had lost his place among the animals, but he had gained the chance to stand against Gilgamesh, to balance him, and perhaps to redeem him. The steppe had given him strength. Shamhat had given him direction. Now the city would give him purpose. The story of Enkidu and the sacred harlot reminds us that civilization itself is not born through conquest alone, but through transformation. Humanity advances not only through walls and weapons, but through bread and wine, through language and love, through the subtle shifts that turn wildness into wisdom. Enkidu embodies that shift, and Shamhat is the bridge across which he travels. In her embrace, he becomes more than a beast. In her words, he becomes more than a wanderer. In her guidance, he becomes a man. The wild man of the steppe had been called forth by the gods to stand against Gilgamesh. Through Shamhat, he was made ready. The king of Uruk would soon meet his equal, and the tale of their encounter would reshape them both. But it all began at the waters of the steppe, with a woman's arms, with bread and wine, with the first steps from wilderness into the human world. The day came when Enkidu entered the gates of Uruk, no longer clothed in the innocence of the wilderness, but in the garments of men. The people of the city gathered in the streets, whispering and staring at this stranger, whose strength was said to rival their king. He was broad-shouldered and fierce, his eyes burning with the wildness of the steppe, even as his body bore the marks of civilization. Word spread quickly that the gods had shaped him to be Gilgamesh's equal, and the people felt a shiver of hope. Perhaps here was the answer to their prayers, the one who could stand against the king who took what he wished and left the city restless under his hand. Gilgamesh, as always, was at the heart of his city. He strode through the streets like a lion, proud and unyielding, certain of his supremacy. When he heard of the wild man who had entered Uruk, his curiosity sharpened into challenge. For too long he had believed no one could stand beside him, no one could restrain him. Now the gods had sent an equal, and the meeting between them was inevitable. The clash came not in battlefields nor distant campaigns, but in the very streets of Uruk. The people looked on as the two men faced each other, their bodies taut with power, their eyes locked in unspoken defiance. Gilgamesh stepped forward first, his voice booming through the air, commanding as always. Yet Enkidu did not bow, did not shrink, did not tremble. He blocked the king's path, and for the first time in his life, Gilgamesh felt resistance. Their hands met not in greeting, but in force, and the wrestling began. The ground shook beneath them as their limbs strained, muscles swelling with the effort of two beings who were more than men. Dust rose in clouds, bricks quivered in their mortar, and the people gasped as the two giants grappled. Gilgamesh pressed forward with the pride of kingship, his strength honed by years of ruling without question. Enkidu pressed back with the raw might of nature, the untamed force of the wilderness still burning in his veins. They locked arms, twisted, heaved, and slammed against the walls of Uruk until the very city echoed with their struggle. For hours they fought, neither yielding, neither besting the other. Sweat streamed down their faces, their feet dug trenches into the earth, and their roars rang out like thunder. It was a battle not only of strength but of will, a test of whether pride or freedom would prevail. At last, as the dust settled and their bodies strained to the limit, a strange thing happened. Gilgamesh, who had never before met an equal, felt something shift within him. He looked into the eyes of Enkidu, and instead of hatred he found respect. Enkidu too felt the same. They had fought with all their strength, and yet neither had conquered. In that moment, they understood each other. They were not enemies. They were reflections. The wrestling ended not with victory, but with laughter. Gilgamesh, still panting, grasped Enkidu's shoulder, and Enkidu returned the gesture. What had begun as combat ended as brotherhood. The people, who had feared the clash, now marveled at the sight of their king standing arm in arm with the wild man. The gods had not only answered their cries for justice, they had given Gilgamesh something he had never known before: a friend. The bond between them was more than companionship. It was a meeting of opposites, a fusion of wilderness and civilization, of arrogance and humility, of rule and rebellion. Together they balanced one another, each filling what the other lacked. Gilgamesh, once a tyrant who thought only of himself, began to see through Enkidu's eyes the value of loyalty and restraint. Enkidu, once a beast of the steppe who knew nothing of cities, began to learn through Gilgamesh the strength of leadership and the burden of kingship. The epic calls them brothers, though no blood tied them. They were bound by something deeper than lineage, the recognition of equality. In a world where no one could rival Gilgamesh, Enkidu was his mirror, his counterpart. Their friendship became the heartbeat of the story, the foundation upon which all their adventures would rise. From that day, Gilgamesh was no longer alone. Where he had once walked the streets of Uruk with unchecked pride, he now had beside him a companion who could challenge his arrogance and share his burdens. Enkidu too was transformed, no longer wandering without purpose, no longer half beast, half man, but a true companion whose destiny was tied to the fate of a king. The people of Uruk, watching, knew they had witnessed something greater than combat. They had seen the birth of balance. The wild man had met the tyrant, and in their struggle, both had changed. The walls of Uruk, which had once seemed to imprison them, now echoed with the promise of new stories, of journeys that neither could take alone. The wrestling of brothers was more than a fight. It was the turning point of the epic, the moment when Gilgamesh began to walk the path toward wisdom, and Enkidu began to walk the path toward destiny. From that dust and sweat and laughter was born a friendship that would be sung for thousands of years, etched into clay, remembered long after the stones of Uruk had crumbled. And so two men stood side by side where once they had wrestled. They were no longer opponents but allies, bound by the test of strength and the recognition of equals. The gods had created Enkidu to balance Gilgamesh, but they had done something greater still. They had given the world the story of a friendship so powerful that even death could not silence it. In the days after their great wrestling, Gilgamesh and Enkidu walked side by side through the streets of Uruk. Where once the people had trembled under the weight of their king's arrogance, now they marveled at the sight of the two together. The wild man had become his equal, his friend, his brother, and the restless energy that once drove Gilgamesh to oppress his people now turned towards something greater. For the king of Uruk was no longer content with walls, temples, and the fleeting praise of men. He wanted his name to echo beyond his lifetime, to be remembered long after his bones returned to dust. And so he set his eyes on the cedar forest. Far to the north, beyond rivers and mountains, stood that vast forest where trees rose higher than spears and their fragrance drifted like incense across the land. It was a place sacred to the gods, guarded by the monstrous figure known as Humbaba, whose very breath was said to be death, whose face struck terror into all who looked upon him. The forest was forbidden to men, for it was the dwelling place of the divine. To enter it was to trespass against the will of the heavens. Yet Gilgamesh, restless for glory, desired nothing more than to cut down its mighty trees and to slay its guardian. In this, he saw not defiance, but destiny. Enkidu, who had lived closer to the ways of gods and beasts, shuddered at the thought. He knew of Humbaba, he knew the terror of the forest, and he feared the vengeance of the gods if they dared such a thing. He begged Gilgamesh to reconsider, to remain within the walls of Uruk, to be satisfied with the kingship already granted to him. But Gilgamesh was relentless. He spoke of death, that shadow which stalks every man, and of how even kings cannot escape it. If death is certain, he said, then let me die with my name on the lips of generations. Let me fall in battle, not in silence. Let me carve my legacy into the world as one who dared what no other man dared. His words struck deep into Enkidu's heart, for he too longed to be remembered. Slowly, his fear turned into resolve. If his brother wished for glory, then he would stand beside him. The two began to prepare for the journey. Gilgamesh ordered weapons to be forged, axes of iron, swords with great hilts, and shields as broad as doors. The craftsmen of Uruk labored day and night, for they knew the task was no ordinary hunt, but an assault upon the dwelling of the gods. The elders of the city wept and pleaded with their king not to go. They told him of Humbaba's might, of his roars that shook the mountains, of his power granted by Enlil, lord of the storm. Yet Gilgamesh's heart was set. He bowed to his mother, the goddess Ninsun, and asked for her blessing. Ninsun, wise in the ways of heaven, went to the roof of the temple and lifted her arms to the sun god Shamash. She prayed for her son's protection, and she adopted Enkidu as her own, so that the two might be bound not only by friendship, but by family. She clothed them with her blessing and commended them into the care of Shamash, who promised to watch over their path with the winds of his favor. The people of Uruk, though fearful, could not help but feel awe at the sight of their king and his companion preparing for a journey that none had ever dared before. And so they set out together, brothers in purpose, bound by courage and the hunger for renown. As they journeyed, the vastness of the land stretched before them, rivers glinting in the sunlight, mountains rising like teeth against the horizon. Gilgamesh, driven by his vision of eternal fame, pressed forward with unwavering determination. Enkidu, though his heart still quivered with dread, found strength in the presence of his friend. For though the forest held terror, he knew that he would not face it alone. The nights on the road were filled with dreams. Gilgamesh, lying beneath the stars, saw visions that both troubled and strengthened him. In one dream, a mountain fell upon him, but a stranger lifted him free. In another, a blazing fire roared, and from it came a figure of light. Each time he woke, shaken, Enkidu interpreted the dreams, assuring him they were signs of victory, promises of divine support. These dreams bound them closer, for they revealed the hand of the gods guiding their fate. At last, they reached the edge of the cedar forest. The air was thick with fragrance, heavy and holy, unlike any place they had known. The trees rose higher than the walls of Uruk, their trunks broad as towers, their branches tangled in the heavens. The ground trembled faintly with the breath of Humbaba, the guardian whose roars echoed through the shadows. Enkidu faltered, for his heart remembered the wilderness and the fear of divine wrath. But Gilgamesh placed a hand upon his shoulder and spoke with calm fire. "We were not made to live forever. Let us carve our names into the cedar and let the world remember that two stood where none dared stand." The quest for fame was no longer just the ambition of a king. It had become the shared destiny of two men who had found in each other the courage to face what lay ahead. They were not gods, nor could they escape death. But by walking into the forest together, by raising their weapons against Humbaba, they would inscribe their lives into the memory of the world. The cedar trees would fall, the guardian would rise, and the story of Gilgamesh and Enkidu would pass from lips to clay, from clay to centuries, from centuries to eternity. The people of Uruk could only wait, their prayers rising with the smoke of their altars, as their king and his brother walked into the sacred forest, not knowing if they would ever return. What they sought was not merely wood, not merely victory, but the one thing that all men crave and few achieve: to be remembered. And so, the journey to fame began, with footsteps echoing into the shadows of cedars older than kings, where death and glory dwelt side by side. The forest was alive with shadows and whispers, as Gilgamesh and Enkidu stepped beneath the towering cedars. The air was thick with resin, sweet and suffocating, and the canopy above shut out the sun, so that even day felt like twilight. Every branch groaned as if it carried a hidden weight. Every gust of wind sounded like a warning. They had crossed the boundary of the human world into the dwelling place of the gods, and they knew it. Yet their steps did not falter. Fame was a flame, burning too hot to be extinguished by fear. From deep within the trees came the first rumble, low and distant like thunder rolling over a mountain. The ground trembled beneath their feet. Enkidu knew that sound. He had heard tales of it when he roamed the wild, and his heart quaked with dread. "That is Humbaba," he whispered, "the one who breathes fire, whose face is terror, whose strength no man can withstand." Gilgamesh gripped his great axe tighter. His courage was not the absence of fear, but the will to master it. He raised his eyes to the dark horizon and called out for the sun god Shamash, whose light had guided them on the journey. And in answer, a sudden blaze of brilliance pierced the canopy, shafts of sunlight falling upon their path, as if the heavens themselves opened a way. Humbaba emerged from the shadows with a roar that split the air. He was a figure of nightmare, his body massive as a mountain, his skin rough as stone, his jaws dripping with flame. His eyes glowed like burning coals, and his very breath scorched the trees around him. The cedars bent under his fury, and the forest itself seemed to rise in his defense. Every step shook the earth. Every cry echoed with the power of Enlil, the storm god who had set him there as guardian. Enkidu faltered, his limbs heavy with terror. All the memory of his wild strength seemed small before such a being. He urged Gilgamesh to retreat, to flee before the wrath of the divine protector. But Gilgamesh, lifting his axe high, called out, "We were born to die. Shall we die nameless, cowering in fear, or shall we carve our story into the cedar and let the world remember us?" His voice rang through the trees, and Enkidu, stirred by the fire of his brother's courage, steadied himself. Together, they advanced. The battle was unlike any other. Humbaba struck with hands like thunderbolts, tearing at the earth, splintering trees as though they were twigs. His breath came as waves of fire, scorching the ground around them. Gilgamesh swung his axe, striking flesh that felt like iron, and the sound rang out like the clash of hammers on anvils. Enkidu hurled himself against the giant, grappling with him as the forest quaked under their struggle. The clash of man and guardian echoed for miles, a storm of fury beneath the cedar canopy. Yet Humbaba was not only brute force. His face held 7 terrors, each a mask of dread that could strike men dumb and turn courage into dust. With every shift of his countenance, fear crept into their hearts. Enkidu felt his strength drain away as despair pressed down upon him. But then the winds of Shamash rose, whipping through the forest, lashing against Humbaba, blinding his eyes and driving him back. The god who had blessed their journey now struck at the guardian, evening the balance. Gilgamesh and Enkidu pressed their attack, their weapons flashing in the shafts of sunlight, their cries rising above the howls of the monster. At last, Humbaba stumbled, brought to his knees by the combined strength of the 2 brothers and the fury of the winds. He looked up at Gilgamesh with eyes no longer blazing with fire, but filled with terror. He pleaded for his life. He offered to serve as a vassal, to guard Gilgamesh's city of Uruk, to cut cedar and build palaces in his name. The king hesitated. The sight of so great a being brought low filled him with both pity and doubt. But Enkidu, breathing hard, reminded him of what must be done. "Do not trust him," he warned. "His words are false. If you spare him, he will rise again, and his vengeance will be beyond imagining. Strike now, while the gods have given you the chance." Gilgamesh's heart was torn, but ambition drove him. He lifted his axe, the blade gleaming in the sunlight, and with a cry he brought it down. The blow struck true, and Humbaba's roar echoed through the cedar forest, shaking the heavens. The guardian of Enlil lay slain, his great body crashing to the earth with a thunder that silenced even the birds. The forest wept resin like tears, and the very air seemed to mourn. The brothers stood panting amidst the wreckage, their hands trembling from the battle. They had triumphed, but their victory was no simple triumph. They had slain not only a monster, but a divine guardian. They had crossed the line between men and gods, and though their fame would indeed echo through generations, so too would the shadow of what they had done. For the slaying of Humbaba was not merely the conquest of nature, but the defiance of divine order. The cedar trees that fell beneath their axes were more than timber. They were the sacred pillars of the world, symbols of the boundary between what was mortal and what was divine. To cut them down was to declare that man's will reached beyond its appointed place. To kill their guardian was to claim mastery over what the gods themselves had set apart. In that moment, Gilgamesh and Enkidu became more than men. They became transgressors, heroes whose glory would be matched only by the consequences of their daring. They cut the cedars and prepared the timber, knowing that what they carried back to Uruk would build more than walls or gates. It would build their legend. The people of their city would marvel at the strength of their king and his brother, at the courage that had brought down the terror of the forest. Songs would be sung, tales would be etched into clay, and their names would travel through time. Yet the gods, watching from above, murmured among themselves. Man had slain what was not meant to be slain, and for such defiance, a price would one day be demanded. As they left the forest, the scent of cedar clinging to their clothes, the blood of Humbaba still fresh upon the ground, they carried with them both triumph and doom. For the slaying of Humbaba was not the end of their journey. It was the beginning of a destiny greater and darker than either could yet imagine. The dust of the cedar forest still clung to Gilgamesh's skin when he returned to Uruk in triumph. The timber of Humbaba's realm was piled high upon carts, and the people poured out to see their king, radiant in victory. Songs rose in the streets, drums beat in celebration, and for the first time the people looked not at a tyrant, but at a hero who had stood against the terrors of the gods and prevailed. His heart swelled with the glory of it, and in that moment, even the gods turned their gaze toward him. Among those who looked upon Gilgamesh was Ishtar, the great goddess of love and war, mistress of the heavens, whose beauty had undone kings and whose wrath had broken nations. She saw the strength in his limbs, the fire in his eyes, and she was seized with desire. She came down in all her splendor, clad in jewels and light, her voice sweet as honey and sharp as steel. Standing before the throne of Uruk, she lifted her gaze to the king and spoke words that would change the fate of men. "Come to me, Gilgamesh," she said. "Be my husband. Grant me your seed, and I will grant you treasures beyond imagining. Harness the chariots of heaven, drawn by lions and storm, and let all peoples bow before us. Kings shall kneel, queens shall serve, and no weapon shall prevail against you. You shall be more than king of Uruk, you shall be king of the world." The people trembled to hear such words, for who could refuse the goddess of heaven? But Gilgamesh, proud and weary of divine meddling, lifted his voice in scorn. His heart remembered the fate of others who had yielded to her embrace, and his tongue was sharp as a blade. He mocked her, saying, "Why should I take you as my wife? What man has ever found happiness with you? Your lovers were struck down, broken and cursed. Tammuz, the shepherd boy, you condemned to endless weeping. The lion you loved, you struck and caged. The horse you cherished, you crippled with the whip and bridle. The shepherd you desired, you smote with disease. The bird you adored, you tore down from the sky and broke its wings. You are a furnace of passion that consumes all who approach. You are a door that lets in the storm but not the calm. You are a palace that collapses upon its guests. Shall I be another fool to fall before you? No, I will not." The city fell silent. The people gasped, for to insult a goddess was to summon death. Ishtar's face blazed with fury, her eyes like stars burning with rage. She shrieked and rose into the heavens, her voice carrying to the throne of Anu, her father, and Antu, her mother. She wept and screamed, demanding vengeance. "Gilgamesh has shamed me before all. Grant me the bull of heaven, that I may strike him down, that his city may starve and his people perish." Anu trembled at her fury, but warned her of the cost. "If I unleash the bull of heaven, 7 years of famine will fall upon the land. Grain will fail, grass will wither, and the people of Uruk will cry out." But Ishtar was not moved. She swore by the throne of heaven that she would break open the gates of the underworld itself if her demand was denied. Faced with her terrible oath, Anu relented, and the bull of heaven was loosed. The earth shook as the beast descended. Its breath split the ground, opening chasms that swallowed men whole. Each bellow brought down walls, each step cracked the stones of the city. The people fled in terror, crying out to their king for deliverance. The bull's nostrils flared with fire, its eyes blazed with the fury of Ishtar, and its horns were sharp enough to pierce mountains. It was no ordinary beast, but a weapon forged by divine wrath, meant to humble the pride of men. Gilgamesh did not stand alone. At his side was Enkidu, his brother in arms, who seized the bull's horns and grappled with its terrible strength. The ground split beneath them, dust and stones flying as man and beast clashed. Gilgamesh raised his great sword, striking at the bull's flank, while Enkidu held it fast, his feet digging into the torn earth. The beast roared, shaking the sky, but the two heroes did not falter. Together, they pressed it back, their shouts rising above the cries of the crowd. At last, Enkidu grasped the bull by its tail, twisting with all the might of his wild-born strength, while Gilgamesh drove his blade deep into its neck. The bull bellowed one final time, a sound that echoed like thunder through the heavens, and then it fell, lifeless, its great body crashing to the earth of Uruk. The ground stilled, and silence swept across the city. The people erupted in joy, hailing their king, praising the brotherhood that had saved them from the wrath of heaven. But Ishtar, standing upon the walls, tore at her hair and screamed. She cursed Gilgamesh, cursed Enkidu, cursed the city that rejoiced at her humiliation. In her rage, she gathered the women of her temple and wailed like mourners for the fallen beast. Enkidu, emboldened by victory, laughed at her from below. He tore a thigh from the carcass of the bull and hurled it toward her, crying out in defiance, "If I could seize you, I would treat you the same. Take your fury back to heaven, for here on earth you have no power." The crowd gasped at his blasphemy, for never before had a man spoken so to a goddess. But Gilgamesh stood beside him, silent, proud, his eyes still burning with the fire of conquest. The slaying of the bull of heaven was both triumph and tragedy. The people saw deliverance, but the gods saw defiance. Gilgamesh had refused the hand of Ishtar, insulted her love, and slain the beast she had unleashed. In the songs of Uruk, his fame rose higher than ever, but in the councils of the gods, his fate was sealed. For no mortal could shame the heavens and walk free of the price. As the sun set over the walls of Uruk, the body of the bull lay stretched upon the ground, a symbol of victory and of doom. The people feasted, sang and danced, but above them, the gods whispered in anger. The brotherhood of Gilgamesh and Enkidu had defied divine wrath once more, but the reckoning of heaven was not yet complete. Their laughter and triumph would soon be silenced by sorrow, for the gods do not forget, and the hand of fate was already moving. The bull of heaven lay broken upon the earth of Uruk. Its vast body sprawled across the streets, its blood seeping into the dust. The air was heavy with the stench of the divine beast's ruin, and the people who only moments before had trembled in terror now shouted in wild celebration. Songs burst from every throat, drums thundered, and dancers filled the squares. Gilgamesh stood tall among them, his sword red with the blood of heaven, and Enkidu at his side, laughing with a joy that shook the walls of the city. For them, the bull was not merely a monster slain, it was proof that no force, not even the wrath of a goddess, could overcome their strength when they stood together. Ishtar, however, had not vanished into silence. From atop the walls, she tore her hair and shrieked curses into the night, calling upon every god who would listen. She gathered her priestesses and wailed like mourners over the carcass of the beast, striking her chest, clawing her face, and filling the city with her cries. Her humiliation burned hotter than fire. To be spurned was shame enough, but to have her vengeance slaughtered and mocked before all the people was a wound she could not endure. Enkidu, daring as always, lifted a thigh torn from the bull's body and hurled it at her in scorn, shouting words that turned the crowd to stunned silence. He laughed at the goddess of heaven and dared her to act. It was a defiance so great that even Gilgamesh, standing proud beside him, felt the weight of it settle like a storm upon the horizon. In the heavens the gods gathered. Anu, father of Ishtar, Enlil, the lord of the winds, Shamash, the radiant sun god, and Ea the wise, all sat in council. The question lay heavy before them. What must be done with the two men who had slain Humbaba, guardian of the cedar forest, and who now had slain the bull of heaven itself? Their fame was growing too vast, their strength too great, their pride too unrestrained. If mortals could stand against such beings and live, what boundary remained between man and God? Anu was stern. They have spilled the blood of what is divine. They have mocked the order of heaven. If such deeds go unpunished, all mortals will believe they can raise their hands against the gods. Enlil thundered his agreement, his voice like the storm, declaring that death must fall upon one of them. Yet Shamash, who had guided them through their battles, spoke in their defense. Gilgamesh and Enkidu are but men, and men seek glory because they know death awaits them. Would you punish courage as if it were treachery? Have they not offered us sacrifices? Have they not lifted our names in prayer? But even Shamash could not still the anger of the council. The decree was made. One of the brothers must die. The balance of the world demanded it. The choice was swift, though cruel. Gilgamesh was 2/3 divine, son of a goddess, and the fates had already woven his story toward other reckonings. Enkidu, born of clay and wilderness, created to balance the king, was mortal in full. It was upon him that the weight of punishment would fall. The gods spoke his doom, and the decision echoed across the heavens like thunder rolling through the firmament. That night, Enkidu dreamed. He saw the great gods seated in judgment, their faces stern, their words heavy with decree. He saw himself condemned, not for cowardice or weakness, but for the strength he had given to his brother, for the defiance they had shared. In the dream, the gods pointed to him and said, "It is you who shall die, Enkidu. Gilgamesh shall live, but you will return to the dust from which you came." He woke in terror, the vision burning in his mind, his breath shallow, his body already trembling with unseen sickness. At first, he raged. He cursed the trapper who had first seen him, cursed Shamhat, who had drawn him from the wild, cursed the city that had made him a man. "If only I had stayed among the gazelles," he cried, "I would not know this pain, nor the doom of gods. I would still drink with the beasts at the watering hole, still run free upon the steppe." His grief was a storm, crashing against all who came near. Yet even as his anger roared, there was sorrow beneath it, the sorrow of one who knows that fate cannot be undone. Gilgamesh listened, stricken with grief. For the first time since they had met, his brother's strength seemed to fail, and he saw not a wild man of clay, but a mortal whose days were numbered. He tried to comfort him, swearing that the gods were unjust, that he would petition them, that he would fight even against heaven for his friend's life. But Enkidu only shook his head. "The gods have spoken, and no man, not even you, can overturn their word." The sickness grew within him. His limbs weakened, his eyes dimmed, his once powerful body wasted as though every hour carried him closer to the dust. Yet even in his decline, the bond between the two brothers shone brighter than ever. They recalled their battles together, their triumphs, the slaying of Humbaba, the laughter they had shared when the bull fell, the dreams of fame that had led them into danger. They held one another as brothers do, knowing that the days of their friendship were numbered, and every word became a farewell. The city of Uruk, once jubilant in victory, now watched in silence as sorrow spread through the palace. The people whispered that the gods had been angered, that their king's pride had called down a terrible price. They feared for their king, yet pitied his companion. For all his wildness, Enkidu had become beloved, his laughter echoing through the streets, his courage inspiring the weak. The shadow of his coming death hung heavy not only over Gilgamesh, but over the entire city. This was the turning point of the tale. The slaying of the bull of heaven, the laughter at the goddess, the triumph that had seemed unshakable, all of it became the doorway into tragedy. For the gods do not forget, and they do not forgive. In the death of Enkidu, the epic would turn from glory to grief, from triumph to loss. Gilgamesh, who had faced monsters and divine wrath without flinching, would soon face the one enemy no man could conquer, death itself. The bull's corpse rotted outside the walls, the people still murmured in unease, and above them, the stars glittered cold and distant. Somewhere in those heavens, the gods had spoken, and their judgment could not be recalled. One of the brothers would fall, and the other would be left to wander in the shadow of that loss. Their story, once a tale of triumph, was already becoming a meditation on mortality, the oldest truth of all. The shadow that had fallen over Enkidu after the slaying of the bull of heaven deepened with every passing day. What began as strange dreams and weakness soon turned into an illness that no sacrifice could cure and no prayer could lift. The strength that once let him run with gazelles and wrestle monsters drained from his body like water leaking from a broken jar. His skin grew pale, his breath shallow, and his laughter, once so full and wild, faded into silence. In his bed he tossed and turned, cursing and weeping by turns, railing against the gods who had condemned him for nothing but loyalty to his brother. Gilgamesh sat at his side, helpless. Never before had he known helplessness. Against Humbaba he had swung his axe and triumphed. Against the bull of heaven he had fought and prevailed. But against the slow wasting of his brother he could do nothing. He, who was 2/3 divine, who had thought himself untouchable, now watched his other half sink into the dust, and no weapon, no strength, no cunning could hold him back. The mighty king of Uruk wept like a child, clutching Enkidu's hands as though by holding on tightly he could keep him from slipping away. Enkidu, in the fever of his sickness, dreamed visions of the underworld. He saw a vast house of darkness where the dead dwelled, clothed in feathers, eating dust, drinking from clay. He saw kings who once ruled, priests who once stood in temples, warriors who once conquered, all brought low, their crowns turned to ashes, their swords rusted into silence. He woke in terror, crying out that he had glimpsed his own fate. "There is no escape," he said. "No man, no king, no warrior returns from the house of dust. Even you, Gilgamesh, though you are strong and part divine, will one day join me there." Gilgamesh pleaded with him not to speak such words, but Enkidu only smiled weakly and touched his hand. "Brother," he whispered, "we sought fame, and we found it. We sought adventure, and we lived it. We stood against the gods themselves, and for a time we prevailed. But now the price must be paid. I was born of the steppe, made of clay, and to clay I must return." His voice faltered, but his eyes held the weight of truth. The people of Uruk mourned even before the end came. They gathered outside the palace, their voices rising in lament, for Enkidu had become as beloved as their king. Children who once ran with him through the markets wept. Elders who had seen his wild strength bowed their heads, and women who had sung of his courage now tore their garments in grief. Yet none grieved as Gilgamesh did. For him, Enkidu was not only a companion, but a brother in spirit, the other half of his own soul. To lose him was to lose the part of himself that laughed, that dared, that loved. The illness stretched on, cruel and unrelenting. Enkidu cursed Shamhat, who had brought him from the wild, cursed the trapper who had first seen him, cursed the city that had claimed him. But in his final hours, his anger softened. He looked at Gilgamesh and said, "It was worth it. To know friendship, to drink wine, to eat bread, to love, and to be loved, even for a short time. It was worth it." And then his eyes closed, his breath stilled, and Enkidu, the wild man who had become a brother, was gone. Gilgamesh cried out like a wounded lion. He threw himself upon the body, refusing to let it go, kissing his brother's face, calling his name again and again. For 7 days and 7 nights he kept vigil, unwilling to bury him, unwilling to believe that death had truly come. He watched as the body began to change, as death marked its claim, and only then did he accept the truth. The king who had faced monsters, who had scorned gods, was broken by grief. For the first time, Gilgamesh knew the weight of mortality, not in stories, not in dreams, but in his own heart. The funeral of Enkidu was like no other. Gilgamesh ordered that the great artisans of Uruk craft a statue of his brother, fashioned from gold and precious stones, so that his memory would endure. The people wailed and cut their hair, offerings were laid at the altars, and priests intoned laments that echoed through the temples. But none of it eased Gilgamesh's sorrow. He tore his robes, cast aside his crown, and wandered the streets like a beggar, crying to the heavens. "Why, gods of heaven, did you take him? Why not me? What is man that you should raise him up only to cast him down? We are but clay, shaped for a moment, then broken." In his mourning, Gilgamesh's grief turned to fear. For if Enkidu, who was strong as a wild bull, who had walked with the animals and defied the gods, could die, then so too would he. All his power, all his triumphs, all his walls and palaces, none of it could save him from the same fate. Death was no longer a distant shadow but a looming certainty. He saw his own end in the stillness of his brother's body, and it filled him with dread. Thus began the transformation of Gilgamesh. Once he had sought only fame, only the songs of men and the treasures of kings. But now he sought something greater, escape from death itself. He would not rest, he would not reign in peace, until he had found the secret of life that does not end. His mourning became the spark of a new quest, one that would carry him far beyond Uruk, into deserts and mountains, across seas, and into the realm of the immortal. Yet none of that could ease the pain in that moment. For all the wisdom he would gain, all the journeys he would take, Gilgamesh would forever carry the memory of Enkidu's death as the wound that never healed. The laughter they had shared, the battles they had fought, the dreams they had dreamed. These became both his strength and his sorrow. Enkidu was gone, and with him went the innocence of the king who once believed he could conquer anything. The epic of Gilgamesh turns on this moment, for here the story becomes not the tale of slaying monsters or defying gods, but the tale of a man confronting the truth that no one escapes. In Enkidu's death lies the heart of the poem, the grief of one friend, the fear of one man, and the question that echoes through all time. If even the mighty must fall, then what remains for us? What can endure? Gilgamesh, broken and grieving, left the body of his brother behind, but he carried the lesson forever. He would seek immortality, he would rage against the limits of life, but he would never again be the man he was before that bed of sickness. For in losing Enkidu, he found the truth of what it means to be human. Gilgamesh wandered the empty streets of Uruk like a ghost. The people bowed before him still, but he no longer saw them. The walls that he had once boasted of, strong and high, now seemed frail, for he knew that even stones would one day crumble into dust. The palaces of kings, the temples of gods, the gardens and markets filled with life, all of it would pass. None of it could endure. Enkidu's body lay in the earth, and the sound of his laughter had already faded into silence. For the first time in his life, Gilgamesh felt the weight of time pressing upon him, relentless and merciless. He had always believed himself untouchable. Born of a mortal king and a goddess, 2/3 divine, he had thought death could not lay a hand upon him. But now he saw the truth written in the stillness of his brother's face. If Enkidu, whose strength had been as wild as the storm, could be brought down, then what hope remained for any man? Kings would fall, warriors would rot, priests and merchants alike would be swallowed by the same silence. No wall could be built high enough, no sword sharp enough, no glory bright enough to hold back the grave. Day after day he refused comfort. He tore his robes, let his hair grow wild, and cried to the heavens, "Must I too die like Enkidu? Must I become dust, my body eaten by worms, my name fading like smoke in the wind? Is this the fate of man, to strive and to build, only to be forgotten?" His voice echoed through the temples, but no god answered. Shamash, who had once sent him light, was silent. Ishtar, whom he had insulted, turned her face away. The great heavens that had once seemed full of favor now loomed empty and cold. At night he dreamed, and in his dreams he saw the house of dust, the same vision that had terrified Enkidu. He saw kings seated in darkness, their crowns gone, their banquets replaced with clay and ash. He saw mighty warriors dragging their feet, stripped of weapons, their swords rusted, their shields broken. He saw the priests who once sang to the gods now crouching in silence, their mouths full of dirt. Every face was feathered like a bird, every hand clutched only emptiness. He woke screaming, drenched in sweat, certain that one day he too would descend into that vast silent house where all men went. Despair clung to him like a cloak. He left behind the throne, the crown, the feasts and music of the palace. He wandered the countryside in rags, like a man already dead, refusing food and sleep, driven by a terror that gnawed at his heart. The people who once sang his praises watched in confusion and sorrow as their king, the mighty Gilgamesh, became a beggar on the roads. He had slain monsters, he had defied gods, but he could not lift his head above the weight of grief. He spoke to the farmers in their fields, to the herders on the steppe, asking if they knew a way to escape death. He searched the faces of travelers, hoping to find someone who could tell him of a man who had defeated the grave. But everywhere the answer was the same. No man lives forever. No king, no warrior, no child of the gods can escape the end. The silence of death comes for all. Yet Gilgamesh could not accept it. Something inside him rebelled against the thought that all his strength, all his triumphs, all the walls of Uruk would mean nothing. He cried out, "If the gods gave us life, why give us also the certainty of death? If they shaped us from clay, why not make us eternal?" His despair was more than sorrow. It was defiance, a refusal to bow to the fate that had claimed his brother. He left Uruk behind. The city's gates closed behind him, its walls standing proud, but its king wandering into the wilderness with nothing but his grief. He wore skins, his hair unkempt, his eyes burning with madness. The animals who once fled before Enkidu now fled before him, for he seemed more beast than man, driven by hunger and pain. He walked through deserts where the wind cut like knives, climbed mountains where no path lay, crossed rivers swollen with flood. He sought something, anything, that could break the chain of death. In the silence of his wandering, he remembered the stories told long ago. There was one man, Utnapishtim, who had survived the great flood and had been granted immortality by the gods. He lived far away, at the edge of the world, beyond mountains and seas, in a place where men could not easily travel. If Gilgamesh could find him, perhaps he could learn the secret of life without end. The thought became a fire in his heart, driving him on through hardship and despair. But even as he began his journey, the weight of his sorrow never left him. He spoke aloud to Enkidu as though his brother still walked beside him. "If you were here, we would laugh together, as we did when we slew Humbaba, as we did when the bull of heaven fell. You would tell me to be strong, to keep walking, to fight. But now I walk alone, and your silence is heavier than any burden." The despair of Gilgamesh was not only for his friend, but for himself. For the truth he could no longer escape. He had seen that strength fails, that courage falters, that even love cannot keep death at bay. His eyes, once filled with pride, now held the fear of every man who looks into the dark and wonders what waits beyond. This was the turning point of his soul. In grief, he had learned love. In loss, he had discovered fear. And in despair, he began to seek something greater than fame or power. He began to seek the secret of life itself. Gilgamesh, once the tyrant who thought only of conquest, was broken into a man who wept, who trembled, who feared his own end. Yet in that breaking was the seed of wisdom, for only those who face the truth of death can begin to ask what it means to live. His despair was the beginning of a greater journey, one that would carry him beyond the reach of his city, beyond the comfort of his people, into the very heart of the mystery that has haunted mankind since the first dawn. How to live knowing that death cannot be escaped. Gilgamesh could not sit upon his throne, nor take solace in the feasts of his palace, nor walk the walls of Uruk without feeling the shadow of death pressing upon him. Every stone reminded him that even the strongest walls crumble. Every face in the streets reminded him that even the youngest child is already walking toward the dust. He could not close his eyes without seeing Enkidu lying still, and in that silence he heard his own fate whispered back to him. It was not enough to be remembered in songs, not enough to build monuments, for all monuments sink into ruin. He wanted more. He wanted to live without end. So he cast aside the crown and robe of kingship and clothed himself in skins. His beard grew tangled, his hair matted, and his face hollowed by sleepless nights. He wandered the earth as though already exiled from the living. His people watched him go. Their mighty king turned into a ragged wanderer, but he did not look back. His heart was fixed on one name, one faint hope, Utnapishtim, the faraway one, who had survived the great flood and been granted life everlasting by the gods. If Gilgamesh could find him, perhaps he too could win the secret of immortality. The journey began with deserts that seemed endless. Sand stretched farther than sight, burning under the sun by day, freezing beneath the stars by night. Gilgamesh pressed on without rest, his lips cracked, his feet torn, his body trembling from thirst. He spoke aloud to the wind as though it might answer him, cursing the gods, begging Enkidu to guide his steps, swearing that he would not stop until he found the path to life without end. Jackals prowled in the night, the cries of vultures circled overhead, but Gilgamesh walked on, driven not by courage alone, but by terror of the grave. After many days, he reached the mountains where the twin peaks touched the sky. These were the gates of the sun, where each dawn the god Shamash rose to bring light to the world, and each dusk he descended to carry it away. No mortal had ever passed beyond them, for they were guarded by scorpion beings, half men and half beasts, with faces fierce as fire and stings that could pierce stone. Their very gaze was death, yet Gilgamesh walked toward them without turning aside. The scorpion man beheld him and marveled. This one is of flesh, yet he walks like one born of the gods. His body is weak with grief, yet his eyes burn with fire. What brings you here, son of Uruk? Gilgamesh bowed his head, but did not waver. I seek Utnapishtim, the one who lives forever. My brother is gone, and I will not rest until I find the secret that will spare me the same fate. The scorpion woman, his mate, pitied him and spoke softly. No man may walk the path you seek, for it is 12 leagues of darkness where no light shines. Only the sun itself can travel there. You will be swallowed by shadow. But Gilgamesh did not turn back. If I must walk in darkness, so be it. Better to perish seeking life than to sit in Uruk waiting for death. The scorpion beings looked upon him and against all wisdom opened the gate. They told him of the path, and he stepped into the blackness. For 12 leagues he stumbled through a tunnel without light. His hands groped blindly, his breath quickened, his mind reeled. At times he thought he heard Enkidu's voice calling to him. At times he thought he felt hands pulling him back. Yet still he walked, counting his steps, refusing to give in. When at last he saw a faint glow, he ran toward it as though fleeing the underworld itself. He emerged into a garden of marvels beyond mortal imagining. Before him stretched trees heavy with fruit not of flesh but of jewels. Lapis and carnelian hung from branches, emeralds and rubies glowed like ripe figs, and the air shimmered with fragrance. This was the edge of the world, where mortal men did not dwell, a place of beauty untouched by time. There he found Siduri, the woman of wisdom, who kept a tavern by the sea. She saw him ragged and wild, his face gaunt with grief, and barred her gate. Who are you, stranger, who looks more like a beast than a king? Why do you wander in rags, your cheeks hollow, your eyes haunted? Gilgamesh cried to her, I am Gilgamesh, king of Uruk. I am seeking Utnapishtim, the one who lives forever. My brother Enkidu is gone, and I am afraid. Must I too lie in dust? Must I too eat clay in the house of darkness? Tell me, woman, where he may be found. Siduri looked on him with pity, for she saw that he was broken by fear. She told him that death is the fate of all men, that joy is found in bread, in wine, in family and love. For the gods had decreed mortality for mankind, and immortality only for themselves. Fill your belly, she said. Rejoice in the wife you love. Cherish the child who holds your hand, for these are the gifts of life. But Gilgamesh struck his breast and refused her counsel. These gifts are nothing if they end. I will not accept the fate of clay. Tell me the way, or I will press on alone. At last she told him of Urshanabi, the boatman of Utnapishtim, who waited by the waters of death that no mortal could cross. To find him, Gilgamesh must journey still farther, through wilderness and sorrow, until he reached the shore, where even the waves whispered of the underworld. So he pressed on, his body weary, but his spirit relentless. He crossed mountains where the air was thin and cold, where snow burned his skin and storms howled like demons. He waded rivers that pulled at his legs, fought off beasts that prowled the wilderness, and at every step he spoke Enkidu's name as though calling him back from the dust. Hunger gnawed, thirst scorched, but still he did not turn back. Thus Gilgamesh, once king in splendor, now wandered like a beggar at the edge of the world, searching for one man who had conquered death. His crown was gone, his throne abandoned, his people far behind. Yet his fear drove him onward, a fear stronger than hunger, stronger than exhaustion, stronger even than the grief that had begun his journey. For he had seen that even kings fall into silence, and he would not rest until he found the secret that might save him from that same fate. The deserts could not stop him, the mountains could not hold him, and the seas yet waited. He had become a man stripped to his essence, no longer seeking glory or conquest, but only the answer to one question. Must man die, or is there a way to live forever? The peaks of Mashu rose like jagged teeth against the horizon, their summits piercing the very sky where the sun was said to rise and set. Few men had ever laid eyes upon them, and none had passed beyond, for these mountains were the threshold between the mortal world and the realm of the gods. Gilgamesh, ragged and worn, his skin darkened by sun and wind, stumbled toward them with the desperation of one who would rather die in pursuit than live in despair. His heart trembled, but his will drove him on. At the gates of Mashu stood the scorpion beings, guardians of the sun's path. Their forms were terrible, half human and half beast, with bodies of iron and stings that curved over their backs like spears poised to strike. Their eyes glowed like embers, and their gaze alone could unravel the strength of men. When Gilgamesh approached, the ground shook beneath their feet, and they raised their voices in thunder. "Who is this," said the scorpion man, "who dares to come here clothed in rags, gaunt with grief, bearing the look of both man and god?" His mate, the scorpion woman, looked more closely and spoke with pity. "He is no ordinary mortal. 2/3 of him is divine, yet his body is weary with death's shadow. He comes here broken, yet his eyes burn with the fire of one who will not turn aside." Gilgamesh fell to his knees before them, pressing his forehead to the earth. "I am Gilgamesh, king of Uruk. I come in search of Utnapishtim, the one who lives forever. My brother is gone. My heart is heavy, and I cannot accept the silence of the grave. Tell me the way, for I will walk it, even if it leads me to darkness itself." The scorpion man lifted his massive head, and his voice rumbled like stone. "No mortal has walked this road. It lies in the very bowels of the mountains, 12 leagues of utter darkness, where even the eyes of the gods strain to see. Only the sun itself passes there, each dawn rising from the east, each dusk sinking into the west. You will be swallowed by the void. Turn back, son of Uruk, for death is what waits you." But Gilgamesh, desperate and unyielding, cried out, "Better to perish on the road than to live in fear. If I must be undone, let it be in seeking the truth." The scorpion woman, moved by his courage, spoke softly to her mate. "Let him pass. His sorrow has already stripped him bare. The gods themselves must have sent him here." And so, though it was against all law, they opened the gates of Mashu and allowed him through. Beyond the gates stretched a passage carved into the heart of the mountains, a tunnel so vast and deep that its walls seemed to breathe shadow. Gilgamesh stepped into it, and at once he was wrapped in night so thick he could not see his own hands. No torch could burn there, no star could pierce it, for this was the road of the sun, a path meant only for the chariot of day. For 1 league he walked, and the darkness pressed against him like a weight, crushing and suffocating. He could not tell if he moved at all, only that his breath echoed strangely in the void. For 2 leagues he stumbled, and fear gnawed at his bones. By the 3rd league, his heart cried out that he was lost forever. But he pressed on, counting each step as though numbers might anchor him to the world. At the halfway mark, when 6 leagues were behind him, he felt madness clawing at his mind. He heard whispers in the dark, voices like Enkidu's calling from the house of dust. He stretched his hands but grasped only emptiness. His knees buckled, and he nearly sank to the ground. But still he rose, dragging himself forward, whispering Enkidu's name like a prayer. By the 9th league, his body was numb, his eyes useless, his heart a trembling spark in an ocean of black. The silence was so complete that it roared in his ears. It seemed to him that he had left the world of the living altogether, that he was walking already in the land of the dead. Yet still he would not stop. At the 12th league, just as despair threatened to swallow him entirely, a faint glow appeared ahead. Gilgamesh broke into a run, stumbling and gasping, his lungs aflame, his legs failing beneath him. The light grew brighter, until at last he burst forth from the tunnel into a world unlike any he had ever known. He stood blinking upon the edge of a marvelous garden, where the trees bore jewels in place of fruit. Lapis lazuli gleamed like plums, carnelian glowed like pomegranates, rubies and emeralds hung heavy from branches like figs ripened in the sun. The air shimmered with radiance, and the ground glittered with precious stones, as though the very earth had been scattered with treasure. It was no longer the world of men, but a place where time itself seemed to hold its breath. Gilgamesh fell to his knees, his chest heaving, tears streaming down his face. He had survived the road of the sun, the path of darkness, meant only for the god Shamash. He had walked where no mortal should, and he had emerged alive. Yet the journey had carved itself into him, leaving him hollow-eyed, scarred, and trembling. He had glimpsed the void, had felt death pressing upon him with every step, and though he had passed through, he could not forget the weight of it. This road was more than a passage through mountains. It was a passage through the soul, a descent into the abyss where man confronts his deepest fear. Gilgamesh had entered as a king in rags, desperate for life, and he had come out as one who had faced darkness itself. The cosmic journey mirrored the journey of all men, for every life walks through shadow, every heart wrestles with silence, and every soul seeks the light on the other side. The scorpion beings watched from afar, their faces stern but their eyes softened. They knew what it meant to survive such a trial. Gilgamesh had been tested by the void, and though he was not yet free of death, he had shown the resolve that marks the boundary between despair and discovery. The road of the sun had not destroyed him, it had remade him. Now, standing among the jeweled trees at the edge of the world, Gilgamesh lifted his eyes toward the horizon. Somewhere beyond this garden, across waters no mortal had crossed, dwelled Utnapishtim, the one who had conquered death. The journey was not yet over, but he had stepped beyond the limits of mortal men. The darkness behind him was proof that he would endure whatever lay ahead. Gilgamesh emerged from the jeweled garden and at last came to the waters of death, a vast sea that no mortal boat had ever crossed. There he found Urshanabi, the ferryman of Utnapishtim, guardian of the way across the forbidden waters. With great effort, Gilgamesh persuaded him to take him over, cutting poles from the shore to push the craft forward, for no oar could touch the deadly waves. At last, after long struggle and silence, the far shore appeared. There, in a place where the earth met the heavens and time itself seemed to pause, Gilgamesh saw Utnapishtim, the one called the Distant, the man who had outlived all men. Utnapishtim was not as Gilgamesh expected. He was no god blazing with power, no immortal blazing with youth. He was a man, grey and weathered, his eyes heavy with memory, his face lined with sorrow. Gilgamesh looked upon him with wonder and asked, "How is it that you, a man like any other, have been granted life without end? What did you do that I have not done? Tell me, for I have walked through desert and mountain, through darkness and despair, seeking the secret that might save me." Utnapishtim regarded him long and spoke gently, as one who carries wisdom too heavy to bear. "Gilgamesh, you have come far, farther than any mortal, but you ask for what the gods did not intend for man. Life and death are bound together, and to one they gave eternal life, but to many they gave the gift of mortality. Yet since you have come, I will tell you why I was spared, though it was not by my strength nor my cunning, but by fate and by grace of the gods." Then Utnapishtim began to tell the tale of the flood. He spoke of the days when the world was young, when men multiplied in the land, and their noise rose like a storm to the ears of the great gods. Enlil, lord of wind and storm, grew angry at the clamour of mankind, and resolved to sweep them away. The council of gods agreed to send a flood that would drown every living thing, leaving the earth silent once more. But Ea, the god of wisdom and of deep waters, pitied mankind. He came to Utnapishtim in a dream and whispered through the walls of his house, warning him of the judgment to come. Tear down your house and build a ship. Leave possessions behind, and take the seed of all living things with you. Make the ship wide as it is long. Roof it over like the depths of the ocean. Into it bring your family, your kin, your craftsmen, and beasts of the field. For the flood will cover the earth and destroy all who dwell upon it. Utnapishtim obeyed. His neighbours mocked him, for they saw a man building a vessel as large as a palace upon dry land. But he did not falter. He gathered wood, sealed the planks with pitch, and filled the ship with food, water, and all that was commanded. When the appointed time came, he and his family entered, and with them came cattle and sheep, wild beasts and birds, every kind of seed and life. The sky grew black, clouds gathered, thunder roared, and the storm broke. The floodgates of heaven were opened, and the fountains of the deep burst forth. For 6 days and 7 nights the storm raged, sweeping away cities, temples, fields, and men. The gods themselves trembled at the violence of their own decree. Ishtar wept, lamenting the destruction of her people, crying that she had counselled evil. The waters rose so high that even the gods cowered like dogs at the edge of the sky. On the 7th day the storm ceased. Silence fell, and the sea lay flat as a mirror. All mankind had been turned to clay. Utnapishtim's ship lodged upon the mountain of Nisir, and there it came to rest. For 7 days it lay fast upon the peak, until at last Utnapishtim released a dove. The bird flew forth, but returned, finding no perch. Then he sent a swallow, and it too returned. At last he sent a raven, and the raven did not return, for it had found dry ground. Utnapishtim opened the ship, and he and his family stepped upon the mountain. He built an altar and offered sacrifice. The sweet smoke rose to the heavens, and the gods, smelling the savour, gathered like flies about it. Enlil, who had decreed destruction, grew furious that any had survived. But Ea reproached him, saying, "You were cruel. You should have punished the sinner, not destroyed the innocent with the guilty. Now learn mercy, for man must endure, or else your worshippers will be no more." So Enlil relented. He entered the ship, took Utnapishtim and his wife by the hand, and blessed them. "Until now you were mortal, but henceforth you shall live far away at the mouth of the rivers. To you alone among men we grant life everlasting." And so Utnapishtim and his wife were set apart, dwelling in a place beyond the world of men, where death could not reach them. Gilgamesh listened, his heart burning with both hope and sorrow. "If you were granted immortality, then teach me the secret. Show me what sacrifice, what labour, what trial must be endured, and I too will endure it. I will not return to Uruk empty-handed. I cannot face the grave." But Utnapishtim shook his head. "What I was given cannot be given again. It was the gift of the gods at a moment when they repented of their wrath. No strength of yours can win it, no journey of yours can earn it. Mortal you are, and mortal you will remain." These words struck Gilgamesh like a blow. He had crossed deserts, climbed mountains, walked 12 leagues of darkness, and crossed the waters of death, only to hear that what he sought could not be gained. He sat in silence, his hands trembling, his eyes hollow with despair. Yet still he would not yield. "Then test me," he begged. "Let me prove that I am worthy. Give me a trial, and I will show that no man has sought life more fiercely than I." And Utnapishtim, moved by pity and perhaps by curiosity, agreed to give him a test. But the story of that trial was yet to unfold. For now, Gilgamesh had heard the tale of the flood, the oldest memory of mankind's survival, a story that would echo through ages to come. He knew at last how fragile life was, how easily gods could sweep away all that men built, and how slender the thread was that held him to the world. Yet he also knew that one man had escaped, one man had endured, and it kept alive the faint spark of hope that perhaps he too could find a way. Utnapishtim looked long at Gilgamesh, who sat weary and hollow-eyed at the edge of the world. The king of Uruk had crossed deserts and mountains, walked through leagues of darkness, and sailed the waters of death, yet the gift he sought was still beyond his grasp. The immortal survivor of the flood had told him plainly that eternal life was not for men, that the gods had granted it only once and never again. But Gilgamesh would not let go of hope. He begged for some secret, some path, some chance to hold back the fate that had already claimed Enkidu, and waited now for him. Moved by pity, Utnapishtim leaned close and whispered of a hidden thing. There is no way to live forever, son of Uruk. But there is a plant, a thorny root that lies at the bottom of the deep waters. It is called the old man becomes young. Its taste is bitter, its spines sharp, but it has the power to restore youth to one who eats it. Not eternal life, but renewal, a turning back of years. If you would claim it, dive into the abyss and bring it forth. Perhaps then your people will know its blessing, even if you yourself cannot escape the end. At these words, hope flared again in Gilgamesh's heart. He stripped off his skins, tied heavy stones to his feet, and cast himself into the depths. The cold of the abyss closed over him, pressing upon his chest, tearing at his lungs. Down he sank, deeper and deeper, until his hands touched the floor of the sea. There among the silt and shadows, he felt the rough spines of the plant. He tore it free, its roots bleeding into the dark waters, and with great effort he cut loose the stones and rose toward the surface. Breaking into the air, gasping and trembling, he held the plant aloft in triumph. "This is it," he cried. "This is the gift that will free us from despair. Not for me alone will I keep it, but for the people of Uruk. I will share it with the old, and they shall be young again. The shepherd shall rise with the strength of a boy. The mother shall laugh with the face of a maiden. Together we shall know renewal." His heart surged with joy, for though he had not gained immortality, he believed he had found a treasure greater than any wall or palace. He began the long journey back, carrying the plant carefully, guarding it as though it were his own life. He spoke aloud to Enkidu as though his brother still walked beside him. "You see, my friend, I have done it. Though you are gone, I will give this to the people, and their sorrow will end. We will have youth again, and death will not steal our joy so soon." The thought lightened his steps, and for the first time since Enkidu's death, he smiled. But fate was watching, silent and patient. One night, as Gilgamesh rested by a cool pool, he set the plant beside him while he bathed. The scent of the waters drew a serpent, ancient and cunning. Slithering from the depths, it crept upon the plant. Its tongue flickered, its coils tightened, and in a single swift motion it seized the root and swallowed it whole. As it slithered away, its skin cracked and peeled, and before Gilgamesh's eyes the serpent shed its old skin and glistened with new youth. Gilgamesh cried out in despair, plunging after it, but the serpent was gone, sliding into the waters where no hand could reach. He fell to his knees, striking the earth, his tears mingling with the dust. All his journey, all his suffering, all his desperate hope had been for nothing. The plant was lost, and with it the chance to give his people the gift of renewal. He had held it in his hands, only to see it stolen by a creature of the wild. In that moment he understood the cruelty of fate. What is gained may be lost. What is found may be stolen. What is cherished may be broken. No man can hold back time, not with strength, not with courage, not with wisdom. The serpent would live on, shedding its skin, renewing itself, while men would wither and die. The gods had sealed the order of the world, and even a king could not overturn it. Gilgamesh sat long in silence, staring into the pool, where the ripples faded into stillness. His heart was heavy, but within that heaviness was also a strange clarity. He had sought to conquer death, but death had conquered him. Yet in losing the plant, he gained a deeper truth. Immortality is not in roots or waters, not in flesh or crown. It lies in what endures after us, the walls we build, the songs we inspire, the love we give and receive. So he rose, sorrowful, but no longer frantic. He turned his steps back toward Uruk, carrying nothing but memory. His hands were empty, yet his mind carried a treasure greater than the plant. He had learned that man's fate is not to escape death, but to face it with open eyes. The kind serpent would renew its skin, but men would renew their names in story and in legacy. When he returned at last to Uruk, the walls shone in the sun, high and strong, built by the hands of men. He looked upon them with new eyes, seeing not futility, but endurance. He thought of Enkidu, whose laughter still echoed in his heart, and knew that his brother lived on in him. The plant of eternal youth was gone, but the lesson it carried remained. Life is fleeting, and because it is fleeting, it is precious. Thus the bitter loss became a kind of gift, for Gilgamesh would never again waste his days in tyranny or pride. He had walked through darkness, faced gods and monsters, crossed the waters of death, and returned to his city with empty hands but a fuller soul. He had sought eternity and found instead the truth of what it means to be human. And though his body would one day crumble, his story would live forever, carried in the voices of those who remembered the king of Uruk, who sought life and found wisdom. The long road home stretched before Gilgamesh, and each step was heavier than the last. He had crossed deserts, mountains and seas, had walked through 12 leagues of darkness, had met the survivor of the flood, and had held in his hands the plant of renewal. Yet now his hands were empty. The serpent had stolen what he thought would be his triumph, and no effort could bring it back. He had fought gods, slain monsters, defied the heavens, and still he had been defeated by the smallest of creatures, a serpent that slithered silently and vanished into the depths. It was a cruel reminder that man does not master fate. But as the dust of the wilderness rose around his weary feet, a different thought began to take root in his heart. He had set out to conquer death, and he had failed. Yet along the way, he had seen what no man had seen, endured what no man had endured, and returned alive. His failure had stripped him of illusions, but it had given him something else: understanding. For the first time, he began to see that the measure of a man is not in escaping death, but in what he builds, what he loves, and what endures after him. When at last the walls of Uruk rose before him, Gilgamesh paused and gazed upon them as though seeing them for the first time. The sun caught the stone, glowing gold upon the towers, and the shadows stretched long across the land. The gates stood firm, the streets within filled with life, and he heard the voices of his people rising like music into the air. These were not the jewels of a garden at the edge of the world, nor the secrets of a flood survivor. These were the works of human hands, fragile yet enduring, mortal yet magnificent. He turned to the companion who now existed only in memory, speaking aloud to Enkidu as though he still walked at his side. "Look, brother, behold the walls of Uruk, the work of our hands and our fathers' hands. This is what remains when we are gone. The gods denied me eternity, but they cannot deny me this. My people will walk these streets long after my bones are dust. They will raise their children within these walls. They will tell stories at the gates. They will remember." His people gathered to meet him. Their king returned at last. They looked upon him with awe, for he had left as a man driven mad by grief, wild and desperate, and he returned with a strange calm upon his face. They asked him what he had found, what treasures he had brought from the edge of the world, and he told them of the plant, of how it had been stolen, of how even kings could not escape the hand of fate. But he also pointed to the walls that rose around them, to the temples that touched the sky, to the markets that bustled with life. Here is our immortality, he said, not in flesh, but in what we create together, not in endless youth, but in the memory of what we build. The people listened, and they understood. For though no man could live forever, the city stood as a testament to their labor, their dreams, and their hope. Generations would come and go, but Uruk would remain, its stones carrying the names of those who had lived, its towers rising as monuments to their struggle against time. Gilgamesh walked the streets once more, no longer with the arrogance of a tyrant, but with the eyes of one who knew sorrow and wisdom. He saw the children playing, the merchants shouting their wares, the craftsmen shaping wood and stone, the priests singing their hymns. He saw life in all its fleeting beauty, and he knew it was enough. For what is eternity if it cannot taste bread, drink wine, hear laughter, or feel the warmth of a friend's hand? Night fell, and Gilgamesh stood upon the highest tower of the city, looking out over the plain where the Euphrates wound like a silver serpent in the starlight. He thought of Enkidu, whose laughter once echoed through these streets, and of all that he had lost. Yet he no longer raged against the gods. Instead he whispered, "You are gone, but I will live for both of us. Your memory will not fade, for I will tell your story, and in that telling, you will endure." Thus Gilgamesh returned not with the gift of eternal youth, but with wisdom that would outlast even his reign. He had learned that immortality is not a prize snatched from the gods, but a legacy forged in the hearts of men. Uruk's walls were his monument, his people, his memory, his story, his eternity. And so, the epic ends where it began, upon the shining walls of Uruk, built by mortal hands but raised to touch the sky. Gilgamesh, once a king who sought to defy death, stood as a man who had come to understand life. His journey was not in vain, for though his body would one day rest in the dust, his name, his deeds, and his story would be told for thousands of years. The gods had denied him eternity, but mankind had given it to him in another form. The king returned, empty-handed, yet fuller than before. He returned without the plant, without the promise of youth, yet bearing a treasure greater than any jewel. The knowledge that to be human is not to live forever, but to live in such a way that one is never forgotten. And in that, Gilgamesh found the immortality he had sought. The story of Gilgamesh is more than the tale of a king who lived and ruled in a distant land. It is the story of every human heart that has ever trembled at the thought of death, every friend who has ever wept at a grave, every ruler who has struggled to balance power with compassion, and every wanderer who has asked what it means to live well in a fleeting world. Beneath its battles with monsters, its encounters with gods, and its journeys to the ends of the earth, the epic speaks of truths so enduring that they still echo thousands of years later. At its heart lies mortality. Gilgamesh began as a man who believed himself untouchable, 2 parts divine and only 1 part mortal, a king whose strength could tear down walls and whose will could bend men and women to his desires. But the death of Enkidu stripped away that illusion. In the stillness of his brother's body, he saw the fate that no crown could prevent, no temple could alter, no army could resist. This was the turning point of the tale, for only then did Gilgamesh learn the truth that every man must one day face, that life is bounded, and that the shadow of death gives weight to all that we do. Without this limit, there is no meaning, only endless repetition. With it, every moment shines brighter because it cannot last. The epic is also the story of friendship. Before Enkidu came, Gilgamesh was a tyrant, feared but unloved, powerful but isolated. Enkidu was his mirror, his rival, and at last his brother. Together they slew Humbaba, together they defied the bull of heaven, Together they shared bread and laughter and dreams. It was through Enkidu that Gilgamesh discovered the fullness of life, the joy of companionship, and the strength that comes not from standing alone, but from standing with another. And it was through Enkidu's death that he discovered grief, that most human of experiences, which humbles kings and peasants alike. Friendship, in the epic, is the bridge between arrogance and wisdom, between isolation and belonging. Then there is the question of kingship. The tale begins with Gilgamesh as a ruler who builds walls and temples but forgets compassion. His people cry out against him, and the gods answer by sending Enkidu to balance him. Through his journeys, his grief, and his despair, Gilgamesh learns that true kingship is not about domination but about stewardship. It is not enough to build walls, one must fill the city within with life and hope. It is not enough to seek glory, one must ensure that the people thrive. By the end, Gilgamesh has not escaped death, but he has become a king who understands what endures. Not tyranny, but the lasting strength of the city and the memory of its people. Most of all, the epic asks about the search for meaning. Gilgamesh sought it first in conquest, slaying Humbaba to carve his name into the cedar forest, defeating the bull of heaven to prove himself stronger than the god's wrath. He sought it next in the desperate pursuit of immortality, traveling to the edge of the world, crossing darkness and waters, holding in his hands the plant of renewal. Yet each quest ended in loss, in disillusion, in the reminder that man cannot outwit time. Only at the end, when he stood before the walls of Uruk and beheld what men had built, did he realize that meaning is not in defying death, but in living fully within its bounds. It is found in friendship, in creation, in memory, and in the stories that outlast the body. The symbolism of the serpent stealing the plant is one of the most haunting images of the poem. The creature of the earth takes what man cannot hold, renewing itself by shedding its skin, while man withers and dies. Yet even in this cruel image, there is a lesson. The serpent renews itself endlessly, but it leaves no memory, no song, no city. Man does not shed his skin, but he builds, he loves, he tells stories. He leaves behind more than flesh. He leaves behind a name, a legacy, a tale to be carried on the lips of generations. In that sense, Gilgamesh achieves the immortality he sought, though not in the way he imagined. The epic also shows the tension between gods and men. The gods are powerful, capricious, and eternal, yet they are also dependent on the offerings and prayers of mankind. They grant gifts and snatch them away. They bless and curse. They destroy in floods and relent in mercy. But their immortality does not make them wiser. In contrast, man, bound by death, is driven to create, to cherish, to seek meaning. The gods may endure forever, but it is man who builds walls, who sings songs, who writes on clay so that his story is remembered. In this way, the poem elevates humanity, showing that mortality is not merely a curse, but a source of greatness. The search of Gilgamesh is the search of all mankind. We ask the same questions he did. What endures? How do we face death? How do we live well in the time that is given? His journey offers no escape from the grave, but it offers something far greater, the reminder that our lives matter precisely because they are brief. Each friendship, each act of love, each creation carries weight because it will one day end. In that ending, there is meaning. When Gilgamesh returned to Uruk and looked upon its walls, he realized that he did not need to find eternity in secret plants or distant islands. Eternity was already there, in the stones raised by human hands, in the lives of the people who dwelled within, in the story of a king who loved and lost, who raged and wept, who sought and learned. His immortality was not in flesh, but in memory. His epic, pressed into clay thousands of years ago, still speaks to us, proving that he was right. His name endures, his story endures, his questions endure. Thus, the meaning of the epic is not that man can live forever, but that man can live in such a way that he is never forgotten. Mortality humbles us, friendship redeems us, kingship teaches us responsibility, and the search for meaning drives us beyond despair into wisdom. Gilgamesh did not conquer death, but in telling his story, death did not conquer him. And in remembering his tale, we too find strength to face our own brief lives with courage, love, and purpose. In the middle of the 19th century, long after the stones of Uruk had crumbled, and the memory of Gilgamesh had faded into the dust, his story was brought to light once more. The rediscovery began not with kings or priests, but with explorers and archaeologists who turned their eyes to the mounds of Mesopotamia. These barren hills, rising quietly above the plains of modern Iraq, were in truth the remains of ancient cities, their temples and palaces buried by centuries of sand and silence. Among those who first pierced this silence was Austin Henry Layard, a man driven by curiosity and a hunger for the past. Layard dug at the site of Nineveh, the great capital of the Assyrian Empire, long lost but remembered in scripture as a place of pride and ruin. With spade and persistence, he uncovered walls covered in carved reliefs, colossal statues of winged bulls, and most precious of all, a library belonging to the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal. This library, built in the 7th century before Christ, was filled not with papyrus or parchment, but with thousands of clay tablets etched in the wedge-shaped script of cuneiform. When the rooms were emptied, cart after cart carried the fragments of this forgotten archive to the British Museum in London. At first, the tablets lay like an unsolved riddle, for few could read the ancient script. It was only through decades of painstaking work that scholars began to unlock the language of Sumer, Akkad, and Assyria. And then, in the year 1872, a man named George Smith, an engraver by trade turned self-taught Assyriologist, made a discovery that stunned the world. While poring over fragments from the Library of Nineveh, Smith came upon lines that told of a flood. The story spoke of gods who decreed destruction, of a man warned in a dream to build a great ship, of animals gathered in pairs, of waters that covered the earth, and of a bird sent forth to seek dry land. Smith leapt from his desk, overwhelmed by the revelation. Before him, pressed into clay more than 2,000 years before the time of Christ, was a tale so close to the biblical story of Noah that it could not be ignored. Here was proof that the flood story was not unique to the Hebrew scriptures, but part of a far older tradition, carried down from the earliest civilizations of mankind. The discovery sent shockwaves through Europe, where the Bible was still seen by many as the first and only record of such ancient events. Newspapers carried the story, crowds gathered to hear lectures, and the clay tablets of Nineveh became objects of fascination and controversy. Further study revealed that this flood narrative was not an isolated tale, but part of a larger work, a great epic centered on a king of Uruk named Gilgamesh. Piece by piece, scholars stitched the fragments together, reconstructing a story that had lain buried for millennia. They found the adventures of the tyrant king turned seeker, the creation of Enkidu, the slaying of Humbaba, the wrath of Ishtar, the death of Enkidu, the journey for immortality, and finally the tale of the flood as told by Utnapishtim. What emerged was not only one of the oldest stories ever written, but also a work of staggering beauty and depth, filled with themes of friendship, loss, mortality, and the longing for meaning. The rediscovery of Gilgamesh was more than an archaeological triumph. It forced a reconsideration of history itself. Until then, many in the West had believed that the origins of literature and wisdom began with Greece or with the Bible. Yet here was a story centuries older, written in the soil of Mesopotamia, speaking with the same human voice that still echoes in our own hearts. The recognition that the Hebrews had inherited their flood story from even earlier traditions did not diminish scripture, but deepened it, showing how the long river of human memory had flowed across cultures and ages. For the Victorians, this was both thrilling and unsettling. On the one hand, it confirmed the antiquity of biblical traditions. On the other, it revealed that those traditions were not unique, but part of a tapestry of myths and epics woven by many peoples. Some clung more tightly to their faith, seeing in the flood story evidence of a shared memory of a real event. Others felt shaken, for if the Bible's stories could be found elsewhere, then its claim to stand alone as divine revelation was called into question. George Smith himself was not content to stop with fragments. With the support of the British Museum, he travelled to Mesopotamia in search of more tablets that might complete the flood story. There, under the burning sun, amid the ruins of Nineveh and other ancient cities, he unearthed new pieces of the epic, fitting them together like shards of a broken mirror. By his labour, the voice of Gilgamesh, silenced for thousands of years, spoke again. The rediscovery marked the beginning of modern Assyriology and transformed the way we view the ancient world. Gilgamesh, once only a name whispered in half-forgotten legends, was revealed as the hero of the earliest epic, a king who wrestled with gods and grief, who built walls and sought immortality, and whose story became the seed of myths that echoed across continents. From the clay of Mesopotamia came proof that mankind's questions about death, meaning, and the divine had been asked long before the rise of the classical world or the writing of Holy Scripture. The tale of Gilgamesh's rediscovery is itself a kind of epic, filled with persistence, revelation, and wonder. 19th-century explorers pried open the gates of forgotten cities. Scholars bent over fragments, piecing together words that had not been read for 2,000 years. And out of that dust and silence came the oldest story of all, reminding us that though civilizations may fall, the human voice endures. Thus, the story of Gilgamesh returned to us, not as a relic, but as a mirror. It showed that our questions are ancient, our griefs timeless, our hopes as old as the first cities. The flood story shocked the world with its echoes of Noah, but the deeper shock was this. Across millennia, across languages, across the fall of empires, the voice of a king from Uruk still speaks, still asks, still searches. And in that rediscovery, mankind found not only its oldest epic, but also itself. The story of Gilgamesh did not end when the last lines were pressed into clay. Its echoes spread far beyond the walls of Uruk, carried in the memories of scribes, priests, and poets, who adapted its themes into new tongues and new traditions. Though the tablets were broken and buried for centuries, their influence endured like seeds lying dormant beneath the soil, ready to bloom in the words of later civilizations. The epic is not only the oldest known story of humankind, but also one of the most enduring, for its ideas and images found their way into the myths, scriptures, and philosophies of peoples across the ancient world. Within Mesopotamia itself, Gilgamesh became more than a king of old. He was revered as a semi-divine judge of the dead, a figure invoked in prayers and incantations, a hero whose adventures were retold in schools to teach both language and morality. Clay tablets discovered in Assyria, Babylonia, and beyond show that his story was copied and recopied for centuries, each generation finding new meaning in his grief, his search for wisdom, and his confrontation with death. In some regions, his name alone became a symbol of heroism, uttered like a proverb to mark courage and ambition. The Mesopotamians saw in him the mirror of their own fate, for just as their empires rose and fell, so too did Gilgamesh struggle against forces greater than himself. From these fertile beginnings, the themes of Gilgamesh seeped into Hebrew tradition. The most obvious example is the flood story told by Utnapishtim. Scholars have long noted its striking parallels to the account of Noah in the Hebrew scriptures. A divine warning of destruction, the building of a great vessel, the preservation of life through chosen survivors, the sending forth of birds to test the waters, and the eventual resting of the ship upon solid ground. Whether the Hebrews encountered this tale during their exile in Babylon or inherited it from even earlier channels, the connection is undeniable. It demonstrates that the Bible itself is part of a much older stream of storytelling that began in Mesopotamia, where people wrestled with the terror of flood and the hope of survival. Yet the Hebrew account reshaped the tale, placing it in the framework of covenant and divine justice, while Gilgamesh's epic left it as a lesson of mortality and fate. Beyond the flood, echoes of Gilgamesh's journey appear in the Hebrew wisdom tradition. His lament that even kings and warriors must fall to death resonates with passages from Ecclesiastes, where the preacher declares that all is vanity, that no man can add one day to his life by strength or wisdom. The lament psalms, with their raw grief and cries to heaven, are not unlike Gilgamesh weeping over Enkidu. Even the image of the walls of Uruk, praised as the enduring work of human hands, finds kinship with the Hebrew emphasis on remembrance and the building of a people whose legacy lies not in immortality, but in faith and community. The Greeks too inherited fragments of Gilgamesh's legacy. Though their myths were born of different soil, they share remarkable parallels. The friendship of Gilgamesh and Enkidu finds echoes in Achilles and Patroclus, whose bond also ends in tragic loss, driving the hero into grief and rage. The descent of Gilgamesh into the world of darkness mirrors Odysseus's journey into the land of the dead, seeking wisdom from shades long departed. The plant of youth devoured by the serpent recalls the stolen ambrosia of the gods, the constant theme in Greek myth that mortality is the unbreakable boundary separating mankind from the divine. In every case, the Greek epics are more polished, more theatrical, but beneath their surface beats the same pulse that stirred the scribes of Mesopotamia, the desire to tell of heroes who confront mortality, who strive for greatness, and who find meaning in struggle rather than in endless life. As the centuries passed, Gilgamesh's legacy spread further still. In Persian tales, the quest for immortality reappears in new forms, with kings and sages seeking waters of life only to find them withheld or stolen. In Indian traditions, echoes of the epic can be heard in the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, where heroes struggle with fate, death, and the tension between human desire and divine order. Even in later Islamic literature, certain motifs, such as Alexander's search for the fountain of life, seem to carry the distant memory of Gilgamesh's lost plant of youth. The spread of Gilgamesh's influence reminds us that human cultures, though separated by borders and languages, share the same questions. What does it mean to live knowing we will die? How should we use our strength and wisdom? What remains after we are gone? Gilgamesh's story does not give simple answers, but it offers images and themes that proved fertile for civilizations across millennia. From Uruk to Jerusalem, from Greece to Persia, the same longing reappears, clothed in new names but echoing the same cry. In the modern world, the rediscovery of the epic gave it yet another life. Philosophers, poets, and novelists read the story of Gilgamesh and saw in it the earliest expression of existential thought, the first human voice raised in despair against mortality. Psychologists found in the friendship of Gilgamesh and Enkidu the archetype of brotherhood, the symbolic union of civilization and wilderness, reason and instinct. Artists found in its imagery inspiration for paintings, operas, and plays. In the classroom, it became the first chapter in the story of world literature, reminding students that long before Homer sang or Isaiah prophesied, the people of Mesopotamia pressed their fears and hopes into clay. The legacy of Gilgamesh is thus not only ancient but alive. His voice still reaches us across thousands of years, asking the same questions we ask today. We too know grief. We too fear death. We too search for meaning. When we read of his sorrow over Enkidu, of his desperate journey through mountains and seas, of his final acceptance that only memory and achievement endure, we recognize ourselves. In this way, the epic is both the oldest and the most modern of stories. Civilizations rose and fell, but the tale endured because it spoke to what is unchanging in humanity. The Hebrews shaped it into scripture, the Greeks into myth, later peoples into legend. And now, in our own age, it returns not as relic, but as wisdom. Gilgamesh may have failed to find eternal life, but in his story, he achieved what he sought: a name that endures beyond stone, beyond clay, beyond the fall of empires. His legacy is ours, for his struggle is our own, and his voice is the voice of mankind itself. The epic of Gilgamesh that we hold in our hands today is not a single unbroken tale, but a mosaic of fragments, a story pieced together from clay shards that time itself tried to erase. When the Library of Nineveh was unearthed in the 19th century, scholars found not one complete text, but thousands of fragments, some broken into splinters, others crumbled at the edges, their words half lost to erosion. From these pieces, the epic was reconstructed like the ruins of a shattered temple, its columns raised again in imagination, its roof suggested more than restored. The result is a story of extraordinary power, but also one haunted by absence, by silences where once there must have been words. We know that the scribes of Mesopotamia copied and recopied the tale for centuries, preserving it in different versions and languages: Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian. Yet no single tablet has reached us intact. The 12 tablets that make up the standard version of the epic are riddled with gaps. Lines break off mid-sentence. Scenes end abruptly. Entire episodes are missing. When we read Gilgamesh today, we do not read a seamless epic, but a survival, a voice that calls across millennia, but sometimes falters and falls into silence. This incompleteness is both a loss and a gift. On one hand, it denies us the full vision of the ancient poets who shaped the story. We cannot know exactly what was said in certain moments, or how scenes may have originally flowed. We wonder what was contained in the missing lines, what speeches Gilgamesh may have given, what laments the people of Uruk may have sung, what details of the gods' councils have been swallowed forever by time. Yet on the other hand, the gaps themselves invite us into the story. They leave room for imagination, for reflection, for the recognition that even the oldest and most enduring of tales is itself mortal, broken by the same forces of decay that it describes. The most famous of these gaps occurs in the prologue. The first lines are damaged, leaving us to guess at the exact opening words of the world's oldest epic. What survives introduces Gilgamesh as the builder of the walls of Uruk, and as the one who saw the deep. But the beginning is fractured. It is as though the epic begins in mid-breath, reminding us from the start that what we have is a remnant, a survival, not a whole. The missing words themselves become symbolic. No story can begin at the absolute beginning, just as no life can escape the fact that parts of it will vanish from memory. There are other silences too. The encounter with Humbaba, though vividly described, breaks off at key moments, leaving us to reconstruct the speeches of the forest guardian from parallels elsewhere. The lament of Gilgamesh for Enkidu is powerful but incomplete. Lines of his weeping are gone, stolen by time. Even Utnapishtim's flood narrative, so astonishing in its parallels to later traditions, is riddled with breaks that scholars must fill by comparing multiple tablets from different places. It is like hearing a song carried on the wind, beautiful yet interrupted, its verses lost in the distance. Some scholars believe that whole episodes of the epic may be lost. Did the story once contain more of Enkidu's early adventures in the wild? Were there additional journeys of Gilgamesh after his return to Uruk? Did the scribes who copied the tablets in different cities add their own expansions or shortenings of the tale? These questions remain unanswered, for the clay that could have spoken has turned to dust. Yet the very uncertainty adds to the sense of mystery that surrounds Gilgamesh. It feels less like a finished book and more like an echo of a living tradition, the fragment of something vaster than we can now see. The incompleteness also gives the epic a haunting quality that suits its themes. This is, after all, a story about mortality, about the inevitability of loss, about the reality that nothing on earth can last forever. How fitting, then, that the story itself comes to us marked by death and absence, scarred by the centuries that consumed parts of it. Just as Gilgamesh grieves over Enkidu, we too grieve over the missing lines, over the voices silenced in clay. The gaps remind us that stories are mortal things, just as civilizations are. Uruk fell, Nineveh burned, the tablets shattered, and yet something endured. Enough survived for the voice of Gilgamesh to reach us still, half-whispered, broken, but alive. There is a paradox here. The very brokenness of the epic is part of its power. When we read the silences, we feel the passage of thousands of years pressing down upon the words that remain. The gaps become part of the experience, like cracks in an ancient statue that only deepen its majesty. They remind us that memory is fragile, that history is never whole, and that even the greatest stories are subject to time. But they also remind us that survival is possible, that even in fragments, truth can endure. For modern readers, the missing lines invite interpretation. Translators must decide how to bridge the gaps, whether by inserting conjectural words based on parallels or by leaving the silence visible on the page. Every edition of the epic is therefore not only a translation, but also a reconstruction, a work of both scholarship and imagination. In this way, the epic continues to live, not frozen, but dynamic, reshaped again and again, just as it was in Mesopotamian times. The missing tablets are not only a loss, but a challenge, calling each generation to enter the story and give it new voice. Perhaps this is why the epic still feels alive. A story too polished, too perfect, might seem distant, sealed away in the past. But Gilgamesh comes to us as something broken, yet enduring, much like the human condition it describes. We too are incomplete. We too leave behind fragments. We too live knowing that much of who we are will be forgotten. And yet, like Gilgamesh, we hope that something of us will endure, even if only in pieces, carried forward by those who come after. Thus the lost tablets are more than an accident of history. They are part of the legacy. They remind us that the world's first great story is also a mirror of the fragility of memory itself. In the end, perhaps it is fitting that Gilgamesh's tale is unfinished, for so too is the human quest for meaning. Each age must write its own lines, fill its own silences, and wrestle again with the questions the epic leaves open. That is why the story continues to haunt us, not in spite of its incompleteness, but because of it. When Gilgamesh's voice rose again from the clay tablets of Nineveh in the 19th century, it did not remain locked in museums or academic journals. The oldest story of humankind, long buried in silence, began to speak to modern poets, novelists, and philosophers who recognized in it something startlingly alive. Its fragments of grief and longing resonated with an age that was itself wrestling with questions of mortality, meaning, and the place of man in an uncertain universe. Far from being a relic of ancient Mesopotamia, the epic became a mirror for modern humanity, reborn in the imagination of writers who saw in the king of Uruk a fellow traveller in the search for truth. In the early 20th century, when the ruins of empires and the scars of world wars cast doubt on human progress, Gilgamesh's struggle found new relevance. Poets in Europe seized upon his voice as one of defiance and sorrow. Rainer Maria Rilke, the German poet, read the epic and heard in it the echo of his own meditations on death and love. He saw in Gilgamesh's grief for Enkidu the universal grief that every soul must face, the moment when the loss of another becomes the revelation of one's own mortality. For Rilke, Gilgamesh was not a stranger from an alien past, but a brother across time, teaching that only through loss can life's depths be known. In England, T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land, though not explicitly about Gilgamesh, carries the same cadence of a civilization haunted by death and longing for renewal. The image of a king wandering a ruined world, searching for water, for life, for meaning, is deeply akin to Gilgamesh's journey across deserts in search of immortality. Modernism itself, with its fragments and broken voices, seems almost to echo the broken tablets of the epic, as though the incompleteness of Gilgamesh had become a prophecy for the fractured spirit of the modern age. Novelists, too, found in Gilgamesh a fertile source of inspiration. In the years after the flood tablets were translated, stories of great deluges and ancient kings wove their way into Western imagination, fueling adventure tales and biblical retellings alike. Later, in the 20th century, Gilgamesh reappeared in novels that sought to bridge myth and psychology. Writers portrayed him not merely as a figure of myth, but as an archetype, the eternal hero who rages against the limits of human life. Some retellings highlighted the bond of friendship with Enkidu, seeing in it the first great narrative of male companionship, while others emphasized the existential despair of a man who learns that strength and power cannot outlast the grave. The philosophers were no less captivated. When existentialism took root in Europe, with its grim insistence on the inevitability of death and the need to create meaning in a godless world, Gilgamesh appeared again as an ancient voice of the same struggle. His journey is perhaps the first recorded cry of existential despair, the realization that no matter how high a man builds, no matter how many monsters he defeats, he too must die. Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus never wrote explicitly of Gilgamesh, yet the kinship is unmistakable. In Gilgamesh's refusal to accept death, his furious wandering, and his eventual acceptance that meaning lies not in immortality, but in human achievement and memory, one hears the same echo that drives modern existential thought. Even in psychology, the story found a home. Carl Jung, fascinated by myths as expressions of the human unconscious, pointed to Gilgamesh as an archetypal hero, embodying the journey of the self toward integration. Enkidu is the untamed shadow, the wild instinct that must be embraced and transformed. Together, their bond becomes the union of opposites, a symbolic pattern found across mythologies. The death of Enkidu becomes the awakening to mortality, the turning point when the ego realizes its limits. In this way, Gilgamesh's epic became not only literature, but also a map of the psyche, a mirror of inner transformation. The late 20th century saw yet another revival. As the world entered an era of global communication and rediscovered the value of ancient voices, Gilgamesh was translated again and again, each time in a new style. Poets gave him fresh language, sometimes stark and modern, sometimes lyrical and dreamlike. Playwrights brought him to the stage, his cries echoing in darkened theatres. Musicians set parts of the epic to music, chanting its lines as though restoring the ancient rhythms of temple singers. In every form, the story refused to die, finding new audiences, new interpreters, new life. What makes Gilgamesh endure for modern times is not simply its age or its historical importance, but its timeless humanity. The epic does not speak of distant battles alone, but of grief, friendship, love, fear, and the search for meaning. These are the questions of every age. When Gilgamesh weeps over Enkidu, it is the same weeping that poured forth from soldiers in the trenches of the First World War, from families torn apart in the Second, from every heart that has ever lost someone beloved. When he wanders the wilderness searching for the secret of immortality, it is the same wandering that modern man undertakes in science, in philosophy, in religion, seeking some way to escape the shadow of death, and when he returns to Uruk, accepting that what endures is not endless life but the works we leave behind, he speaks the same truth we still wrestle with today. That meaning lies not in conquering death, but in how we live before it comes. In this way, Gilgamesh has become our contemporary. He is not only the king of Uruk, but the king of modern memory, his story reborn each time it is told. From the clay of Mesopotamia to the shelves of modern libraries, from ancient temples to contemporary stages, his voice has traveled unbroken through thousands of years. It speaks now as it did then, asking us what it means to be human, what it means to love, what it means to die, and what it means to build something that endures. Thus, the Epic of Gilgamesh, once thought lost, has become a story for all time. It is the world's first great literature, but also its most enduring mirror. In the shattered lines of those clay tablets, in the grief of a king who learned he could not escape death, modern humanity finds its own reflection. For though the centuries change, the questions remain the same. And so Gilgamesh walks among us still, not as a relic of the past, but as a voice for the present, reborn in the words of poets, philosophers, and dreamers who continue to tell his tale. More than 4,000 years have passed since the first lines of Gilgamesh were pressed into wet clay, yet the voice of that ancient king still reaches us with a clarity that feels both startling and familiar. Time has buried cities, toppled empires, and silenced countless voices, but this one story continues to endure, not because it is the oldest, but because it is forever new. Its words, though broken and scattered, still breathe with the heartbeat of humanity, reminding us that the questions we ask today are the same questions that stirred the people of Uruk in the dawn of civilization. At its heart, Gilgamesh is not a tale of gods and monsters alone, but of friendship, loss, and the aching recognition of mortality. It is the story of a man who believed himself untouchable, who ruled with arrogance, who sought glory at any cost, and who discovered through grief that all strength must one day crumble. In Enkidu, he found not only a companion, but a mirror, a brother who made him more human than divine. And in Enkidu's death, he learned what no power could protect him from, that love makes life radiant, and that its loss makes death unbearable. That revelation is not bound to any century. It is the truth that every person, no matter where or when, must face. We build our walls, we seek our victories, we chase our ambitions. And yet, like Gilgamesh, we discover that the measure of life is not in what we conquer, but in whom we love, in what we create, and in the stories that remain after us. His lament for Enkidu is our lament for every friend, every parent, every child we have buried. His fear of death is our fear. His longing for meaning is our longing. In his voice, we hear our own. The endurance of the epic lies in its honesty. It does not pretend that death can be overcome, nor does it hide the pain of loss behind illusions. Gilgamesh fails in his quest for immortality. The plant of eternal youth is taken from him, and he returns to Uruk empty-handed. Yet in that failure lies the deeper wisdom, that immortality is not given through endless life, but through the works of our hands, the bonds of our hearts, and the memory we leave in others. The walls of Uruk, which he points to at the end of the tale, are not merely stones. They are the symbol of human achievement, of the ability to shape meaning even in the face of death. This is why the story remains forever new. It tells us not to despair that we will die, but to live with greater depth because we will die. It teaches us that to be human is to accept limitation, but also to transcend it through art, through love, through memory. Gilgamesh, who once sought only fame, discovers in the end that his true legacy is not in the monsters he slew, but in the civilization he nurtured, the people he ruled, and the story that bore his name across the centuries. The epic also reminds us that friendship is at the core of human meaning. Without Enkidu, Gilgamesh is incomplete. With him, he learns joy, courage, and the bonds that make even kings human. Their relationship is the emotional center of the tale, and it remains one of the most moving depictions of companionship in world literature. When we read of Gilgamesh mourning his brother, we are reminded that love is what lifts us beyond survival. It is what makes our days more than dust. And though death takes all, love ensures that something of us endures, not in eternity, but in memory. In every age, readers have found themselves reflected in this ancient poem. To the Victorians, it was a startling reminder that the Bible's stories were part of a larger human tradition. To modern poets, it was a voice of raw grief that resonated with the traumas of war and exile. To philosophers, It was the earliest meditation on the absurdity of death and the search for meaning. To us today, it remains a reminder that humanity has always been wrestling with the same questions. When we ask why we are here, when we cry out at the loss of those we love, when we search for something beyond the grave, we are walking the same road that Gilgamesh walked 4 millennia ago. And perhaps that is the truest immortality. Not that we live forever, but that our struggles and questions are shared across the ages. Gilgamesh lives because we still ask what he asked. He endures because his grief is our grief, his fear our fear, his hope our hope. His story shows us that to be human is to be fragile and finite, but also to create meaning in spite of that fragility. The Epic of Gilgamesh closes not with triumph, but with wisdom. The king, who once believed himself above death, stands at the walls of his city and acknowledges what truly endures. Not endless life, but the memory of what we build, the stories we leave behind, the friendships that give us strength. More than 4,000 years later, that truth still speaks, and it always will. Gilgamesh, the forgotten king of Uruk, remains alive in words, in memory, in the endless retelling of his tale. His story is the oldest, and yet it is forever new, because every time it is read, it is lived again. Every time a reader feels the weight of his grief, the longing of his search, the quiet acceptance of his return, the epic becomes part of our own story. That is why Gilgamesh endures. That is why he still speaks. And that is why, as long as humanity asks what it means to live and to die, his voice will never be silenced.